Hello everyone, I know you are going to use this video for falling asleep, so before that, like this video, subscribe to the channel and let me know where you are from. Also, what time is it? No one in their right mind goes near the McCollin house after dark. Even in daylight, its jagged silhouette on the hill seems to stretch against the sky like it's trying to escape. It's not the creaking floors or the stories of blood-stained walls that keep people away. It's not even the fact that anyone who's ever gone inside after sundown has never come out. No, it's the sound. That unbearable, humming whisper that seeps into your bones the moment you step over the threshold. A sound that feels like it's coming from inside your own head, like the house is listening. 17 years ago, the entire Holloway family vanished without a trace from that very house. No signs of struggle. Plates still set on the dinner table. Dogs still tied to the backyard tree. Every door locked from the inside. But the worst part, their youngest daughter's baby monitor was still on, whispering, hissing, crackling like someone was breathing into it. Police checked the tapes. Hours of it. No cries, no talking, just breathing. And a soft, rhythmic knock, 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 like something pacing in circles. Since then, no one's dared stay longer than 5 minutes inside. Until now. Ben Mallory didn't believe in ghosts. Not because he was skeptical, but because he needed them not to be real. At 28, he was tired of running, from his past, from his own memories. Haunted by the disappearance of his older sister Claire, Ben had spent his life chasing explanations. Claire had vanished in 2008. Her car found parked 3 blocks from McCollin House, keys still in the ignition. Her phone on the front seat with a half-written message, "I think I," and nothing more. He was 13 when she disappeared. Old enough to remember her laughter, the way she'd ruffle his hair every time she passed by. Old enough to remember how their mother drank herself into oblivion the year after, and old enough to carry the weight of her absence like a splinter in his spine. He hadn't set foot in Greystone since the funeral, not until the letter arrived. It was handwritten, the address scrawled in red ink, no return address. Inside, one sentence: "If you want the truth about Claire, come to McCollin House, midnight, alone, no name, no clue. Just a Polaroid, grainy, gray, nearly washed out by light, but unmistakably his sister, standing at the attic window of the McCollin house, looking right into the lens, eyes wide, mouth open in what looked like a scream, or a warning. Ben didn't sleep for 2 days. He thought of every possible trick, maybe someone trying to shake him, maybe a cruel hoax. But that image, he couldn't get it out of his head. The shape of her jaw, the necklace she always wore, the tiny scar above her eyebrow. It was Claire. Or it was someone who wanted him to believe it was. At 11:47 p.m., Ben parked his car a block from the house, letting the engine idle a little too long. The street was quiet, eerily so. No wind, no insects. Just a kind of stillness that made your skin tighten. The house towered at the top of the hill, like a burned-out cathedral. Its shutters dangled like crooked teeth. Every window was dark except the attic. A soft, amber glow bled through the cracked pane. He couldn't see anyone inside, but something made his stomach twist. He walked slowly, gravel crunching underfoot like bone. Every step up the hill felt heavier, like the ground didn't want him to reach the top. The front gate was open, squealing faintly in the windless night. The porch groaned as he stepped onto it. A single moth flitted against the yellowed porch light. It was the only sign of life for miles. The door, oddly, wasn't locked. It opened with a sound like a sigh. The air inside was dense, warmer than outside, and smelled of something sweet and rotting, like fruit left in the sun too long. He stepped in. Flashlight gripped tight, his breath loud in the silence. The house greeted him with a stillness that felt alive. Dust spiraled in the beam of his light like it was trying to reach him. The floorboards creaked under his weight, but only where he stepped. Everything else was quiet, unnaturally so. No wind, no house settling, just quiet. And then faintly, something new, a hum. Barely audible, more felt than heard, like standing too close to a power line. But there were no power lines nearby, and no electricity running in the house. He called out. Once. Twice. Nothing. He moved through the living room, past the broken piano, the couch with the ripped cushions, the fireplace filled with soot. Everything was coated in a fine layer of dust except the hallway floor. A set of small, clear footprints, bare, leading toward the basement. Ben's heart began to hammer. He knew better. Every story, every film, every nightmare said don't follow the prints into the basement. But this wasn't a story. It was Claire. It had to be. The door creaked as he pulled it open. The hum grew louder, but still distant, like it came from deep below. The stairs groaned under his weight. The basement was pitch black. He swept his flashlight across the room. Boxes, broken furniture, a child's tricycle half buried in dust. But in the corner, something newer. A table, and on it a tape recorder. It clicked on by itself. Ben jumped back, nearly dropping his light. Static filled the air, loud and violent. Then a voice, faint, distorted, but familiar. Ben, I need you to listen. If you're hearing this, they know you're here. They've always known. They don't see time like we do. The house that doesn't just keep them, it feeds them. Sounds, memories, pain. It was Claire, older, wary. Her voice cracked like dry paper. They told me I could leave, but I didn't, because you'd come. And now they're watching, always listening. There in the walls. Click, silence. The hum was louder now, no longer distant. It pulsed like a heartbeat. The walls began to tremble, just slightly, dust falling in faint streams. Then a scratch, from behind the shelves, then another, a dragging sound. Something moving between the walls, something big. Ben backed away, heart pounding, every part of his body screaming to run, but his feet were rooted. Then, suddenly, the lights. Every bulb in the house flickered to life. Yellow, dim, sickly. The attic window glowed brighter. Then the whispering started, low, multi-layered, like dozens of voices speaking at once. Not words, just sound, just presence. He turned toward the stairs, ready to bolt, when the basement door slammed shut above him. Locked. The flashlight flickered, then died. In the darkness, something breathed. Close. Then, a voice. Right behind him. She never left Ben. She just learned how to listen. He turned, swinging wildly. Nothing. But the whispering was everywhere now. Louder, closer. The walls began to pulse, the hum now a drone. Something was coming. Something with too many fingers. Something that scraped along the ceiling like a centipede made of knives. Then, silence. The kind of silence that presses against your skull like pressure. The kind that makes your ears ring. And then the attic light went out. Ben didn't scream. Not then. He climbed the stairs in the dark, the house groaning like it hated him for moving. Every shadow felt like a hand. Every step a dare. When he reached the top floor, he could hear the ticking. A clock somewhere. But it wasn't counting time. It was counting down. The attic door was slightly ajar. Behind it, a red glow, flickering like firelight. He pushed it open slowly, and froze. Claire stood in the center of the room. Not older, just as she was, 17 years old. Same jeans, same hoodie, same scared eyes. But her mouth was sewn shut, and around her, carved into the floor, a circle of mirrors, each one reflecting something different. In one, she was smiling. In another, she was screaming. In another, she was burning. But all of them turned slowly to face him as he entered. She pointed behind him. Ben turned, and the house breathed in, hard. Every door slammed shut. Every light blew out. The mirrors cracked. And the attic plunged into red. The hum returned, but this time it was inside him. Like his bones were tuning forks. And from somewhere deep in the floorboards came the knock, knock, knock. And then, a voice. Not Claire's. Welcome back, Ben. Let's remember together. Darkness swallowed everything, and the door to the outside was gone. Ben didn't remember blacking out. only the fall. One moment he was standing in the attic, breath clamped in his throat, skin crawling under the pressure of that voice. And the next, he was on the floor of a different room. He couldn't remember walking, couldn't even be sure if he had moved at all. But the attic was gone, the mirrors, the red light, even Claire, gone. And in their place wallpaper, peeling like old skin, faded photos lining the walls, the bitter scent of mildew and something metallic in the air. He sat up too quickly. The room spun. The air buzzed faintly, like there was static running through the floorboards. He blinked hard, trying to orient himself, but nothing made sense. It looked like a nursery, rocking horse, crib, cracked porcelain dolls slumped in corners like they'd been scolded. But everything was off. The colors were wrong. Toys that should have been cheerful were dulled and splattered with grime. And the photos on the wall, they weren't just of strangers. They were of him. Ben. As a child. His first day of school. His 8th birthday. Sitting beside Claire on the swings at Lakeview Park. The photos should not have existed. He stumbled to his feet, breath fogging in the cold air despite the lack of breeze. How had the house gotten those pictures? They were all from his childhood home, long before he'd ever even heard of the McCollin house. He tore one off the wall and flipped it over. No writing, no date, just a smudge of red, like a fingerprint. That's when the lullaby started, soft, off-key. It drifted from somewhere down the hall, twinkling like a wind-up music box but with a cruel slowness, like it was being played by something unfamiliar with melody. Ben froze. The air shifted. The hum was gone, replaced by a sound like someone dragging nails through cloth. He edged toward the door, fingers trembling as they brushed the handle. It turned with a whimper. The hallway outside was longer than it should have been. He could swear it hadn't been this way when he first entered the house. The layout was wrong. Wrong in a way that made his head throb. Doors lined the hallway on either side, each slightly ajar. Behind them, sounds, snippets of conversations, crying, the wet slap of footsteps. He moved quickly, not daring to look into the rooms. Not yet. At the end of the hall stood a tall mirror. Cracked. The glass shimmered slightly as he approached, reflecting not just his body but the space behind him. He stopped. In the mirror, his reflection stood still, unmoving, but behind it, the hallway wasn't empty. A figure loomed in the background, tall, faceless, clothed in strips of torn wallpaper. It had no eyes, only a split running from its forehead to its chest, stitched crudely shut. And yet, Ben felt it watching him. He turned, but the hallway was empty. The reflection smiled. He backed away, pulse thundering in his ears, and slammed open the nearest door, hoping to escape the gaze of the impossible figure. The room he entered was drenched in blue light. A single bulb dangled from the ceiling, swaying slightly despite the still air. The floor was covered in drawings, crayon sketches of children, some happy, others screaming, some crossed out violently in thick, red strokes. In the center of the room sat a small table, and on the table another photograph. This one chilled his blood. It was Claire again. Only this time, her eyes had been scratched out, and below her image, in red ink, she knew. But she stayed. Ben staggered back, knocking over a chair. The crash echoed like a gunshot. From the ceiling above, he heard the thud of footsteps, heavy, deliberate, coming from the attic. But there was no staircase up anymore. The house was changing, reconfiguring itself around him like a maze with a memory. He had to get out, had to find Claire, if she was still alive, or whatever was left of her. He fled into the hall, not looking back at the mirror. The figure would be closer now. He could feel it. He sprinted toward what he hoped was the main stairs, but the house refused logic. Corridors looped back on themselves. Rooms opened into impossible angles, and the light kept shifting. One hallway was drenched in sickly green, another in the cold hue of a winter moon. Voices whispered behind closed doors, some calling his name, some hissing words he couldn't understand. And then he found the door. Tall, ornate, framed in bone, white wood that looked too organic to be decorative. Something had carved symbols into the frame, crude spirals, intersecting circles, and a single word repeated over and over, remember. He hesitated, then pushed it open. The room was massive, larger than the house could possibly hold. The walls pulsed like lungs, and in the center was a circle of beds, old, rusted hospital cots. On each bed lay a child, or what remained of one, eyes open but glazed, mouths stitched shut like Claire's, limbs bound in red thread, skin pale and waxy. And in the center a figure, hunched, muttering, surrounded by Polaroids. It turned slowly as Ben stepped forward. It was Claire, but older, much older. Her hair had thinned, skin gone papery, eyes hollow with decades of nightmares. But it was her. He'd know her anywhere. Ben, she croaked, voice like leaves blowing across a grave. You shouldn't have come. He fell to his knees beside her, mind racing, heart breaking. I came to find you. I thought you were. I am, she whispered. I'm not who I was. The house that it doesn't let go, it feeds. On memory. On pain. On what we forget and what we remember wrong. It twisted me. Showed me things and made me live them. Ben reached for her hand, but she flinched. No, don't touch me. Not yet. The lights dimmed. The whispering returned. All around them, the children began to stir. Claire's breath hitched. You woke them. Ben stood, scanning the beds. The children twitched, heads turning toward him, eyes unblinking. The air thickened. And then, one by one, they smiled. The whispering turned into giggles. Soft at first, then rising into laughter. Unnatural. Unhinged. They remember you, Ben, Claire rasped, dragging herself to her feet. They know you. The house showed them. Ben backed away. Showed them what? Claire's eyes gleamed with tears. What you forgot. The children rose from the beds, moving slowly, jerking like broken puppets. Ben turned to run. The door was gone. And behind him, the mirror reappeared. Tall, cracked. Inside it, his reflection smiled again. But this time it waved. Then the whispering voice returned. The same voice from the basement. Calm. Mocking. You came for answers, Ben. But memories, they lie. Let's see what yours are hiding. The mirror shattered, and the house screamed. The sound was like nothing Ben had ever heard. Not metal, not wood, not even human. The scream, the house let out, when the mirror shattered, seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. A deafening roar that bypassed the ears and clawed straight into the marrow. Ben clamped his hands to the sides of his head, but it did nothing. His vision blurred. The floor buckled beneath him like the house itself was heaving in agony. The walls twisted. Furniture splintered. Light bled through the cracks in the ceiling. Red, strobe, like as if some malevolent pulse had been switched on inside the walls. The children, if they could still be called that, had stopped laughing. Now they were watching. Every head tilted at the same angle. Every stitched mouth quivering. Then, all at once, they pointed to the center of the room, where Claire had stood just seconds earlier. But now, she was gone. Claire! Ben shouted, the name torn from his throat. Nothing. Just the rustling of thread, the creaking of beds, and that same awful red light growing brighter with each beat of the unseen pulse. He stumbled backward, trying to find a way out, some gap, some crack to slip through, but the walls had closed in. Literally. The grand room he'd entered had shrunk. Its high ceiling now just inches above his head. The door he'd entered through was a jagged scar, sealed shut by something that looked disturbingly like flesh stretched over wood. Then a voice, not loud but near, closer than his own heartbeat. You never remembered the truth, Ben, so I made sure the house would. He turned slowly. Standing behind him was Claire. Not older now, but younger. 17 again, just like in the attic photo. But something was wrong with her face. Too smooth. Her eyes too wide, too still, as though they'd been painted on. Her mouth, no longer sewn shut, smiled mechanically, and when she blinked, it sounded like cracking glass. Ben staggered back, shaking his head. No, no, you were gone, she whispered, tilting her head. Or just rewritten. The smile faded. Her eyes softened. You forgot me, Ben. Everyone did. That's what the house feeds on. It twists what's lost. It traps the things we try to bury. Ben's knees buckled as the truth, or what felt like it, hit him like a wave. It wasn't just about Claire being taken by the house. It was about something else. Something he had done. Or not done. Something buried deep in the folds of his memory. The reflection in the broken mirror shimmered again. But this time, it didn't show the room. It showed a living room he recognized. Their old home. Claire on the couch crying. Their parents screaming at each other in the background. And Ben walking away. Not intervening. Not asking. Just leaving. You knew something was wrong, Claire said, her voice breaking. You heard me that night. You saw me. But you walked away. Ben felt his stomach twist. I was 13. I didn't want to know. She finished for him. Didn't want to remember. He dropped to the floor, unable to hold the weight of her gaze. The guilt felt alive, pressing down on him like fingers on his chest. The hum returned, this time softer, like a lullaby humming itself into his skin. Around him, the children began to shuffle again, stepping closer, their shadows crawling up the walls like vines. You didn't come to save me, Ben, Claire said, crouching beside him. Her eyes now glistened, more human than before. You came because the lie stopped working. Suddenly, something struck the wall from the outside. A deep, echoing thud, like a battering ram slamming against the bones of the house. The children shrieked and scattered, vanishing into the cracks in the floor. Claire stood, eyes wide. No, not yet. Ben scrambled to his feet. What was that? She didn't answer. Thud, again. Closer this time. The red light dimmed. The ceiling split open, and through it something began to crawl. At first, it looked like roots, long, sinewy tendrils descending from the dark. But as they uncoiled, Ben saw what they really were: arms, dozens of them, pale, too thin, all human, reaching, grasping, twitching with unnatural spasms. Fingers bent the wrong way, nails like obsidian. Each arm had a scar running down its length, and from every scar leaked ink, black fluid that hissed when it hit the floor. Ben grabbed Claire's arm. We have to go, now. She nodded, but her body was beginning to flicker, fading like a dying signal. There's a door, she said, voice wavering. One level down. But it only opens if the house lets it. The arms dropped lower. They weren't reaching for Claire. They were reaching for him. He didn't wait. He ran. The hallway outside was different again. Longer, now made of stone instead of wood. As if the house had stripped away its skin and showed him its bones. The walls blood. Not metaphorically. Actual blood, black and thick, oozing from the cracks. Faces pressed through the plaster, some familiar, most not. All whispering. He sprinted past them, feeling the walls breathe in as he passed. Claire's voice rang out from behind him. Don't look back! He didn't. Down a spiral staircase that felt like it looped in on itself, the air growing colder with every step. The hum was now a chant, repeating a name over and over, his name, sometimes whispered, sometimes screamed. It rang in his skull, echoing off bone. He reached the bottom. A door. Different from the others. Wooden, yes, but clean. Untouched. No blood. No symbols. Just a single brass knob, and written across it in delicate, beautiful cursive, the room you forgot. Claire appeared beside him again, flickering badly now, barely more than a shimmer. You have to go alone. Ben turned to her, breathing hard. What's inside? Her face darkened. He opened the door and stepped into light. Not blinding, but pure. Gentle. The room was warm, safe. A stark contrast to everything else in the house. It looked normal. A child's bedroom. His bedroom. Everything exactly as it had been at age 13. Posters on the wall. Toy cars scattered across the rug. His journal on the desk. The one he'd lost years ago. He walked forward, half in a trance, and opened it. The first page was blank. The second blank. But the third, I saw her, it read. I saw what he did. I heard her crying, but I didn't tell. I didn't want to be next. Ben felt the breath leave his lungs. I locked the door, the next page read. I turned up the volume on the TV. I waited until it stopped. Then I went to sleep. Tears filled his eyes. He remembered. Claire hadn't just disappeared. She had tried to run. She had begged him for help, and he'd been too scared. He'd let it happen. He let her go. And the house that had built itself around that memory, twisted it, fed on it. That's why the photos were all of him. That's why Claire's voice had sounded like it came from inside his skull. The house hadn't taken her. It had taken his guilt, and now it wanted more. He dropped the journal. The walls cracked. The safe warmth evaporated, replaced by a vacuum that sucked the air from the room. The lights flickered. The red glow returned, and behind him something breathed. Then, a whisper softer than all the rest, right beside his ear. You remember now. But will you confess? He turned. The door was gone, and the floor began to open. The floor didn't open like a trapdoor or give way like rotten wood. It split like skin beneath a scalpel, slow and deliberate, revealing not darkness, but reflection. Not a pit, not a basement, but a mirror stretched endlessly below him. Only it didn't show the room. It didn't show the house. It showed Ben, over and over again, at every age, in every state, laughing, crying, hiding, lying. Dozens of versions of him suspended in the glass, staring up like fish in an aquarium. Their eyes empty, accusing. He staggered backward. But the floor kept unfolding. His bedroom, the last safe place, peeled away piece by piece, dissolving into the growing pit of memory beneath him. The journal slipped from his hand, landed in the reflection, and vanished as if it had never existed. Above him, the walls began to rot. Wallpaper browned, curling up like scorched leaves. The bed frame twisted. The posters peeled away to reveal more writing beneath, repetitions of a single sentence scratched into the wall behind the paper. You knew. You knew. You knew. Ben turned to run. The door had returned. But it wasn't the same. It was taller now, blackened and cracked, pulsing at the seams like something was breathing behind it. In place of the delicate cursive writing, there were handprints, hundreds of them. Children's handprints, all pressed in what looked like soot or blood. At the center, his own. He reached for the knob, even as his gut screamed not to. The second his hand made contact, a bolt of sound surged through him. Not a scream, not a word, but a confession. He didn't hear it. He felt it. A weight sinking into his chest, pulling him down. The door flung open inward, and a gale of whispers rushed past him. Not air, not wind. Thoughts. Thousands of thoughts, too fast to catch, too loud to ignore. Ben stumbled inside. The room was a cathedral of shadows. Rows and rows of pews made from charred wood lined the chamber, all facing a pulpit drenched in candlelight. And at that pulpit himself. An older Ben. Eyes hollow, mouth sewn shut like Claire's had been. He didn't speak, didn't move. He waited. Ben inched forward. The candles flickered, revealing faces in the pews. At first they looked like mannequins, waxy and smooth. But as he stepped closer, he saw who they really were. His mother, his father, Claire, his childhood friend who drowned in the lake, a teacher he never said goodbye to, a stranger whose face he couldn't place but whose eyes knew him. They all sat motionless, except for their mouths. Every one of them was whispering. You knew, you heard, you looked away. You forgot us, you made us shadows. Ben dropped to his knees. No, he whispered. I was just a kid. I didn't know what to do. Laughter echoed from the ceiling. High, pitched, mocking. The older version of himself raised one trembling hand and pointed toward a small black door at the side of the chamber. Another step, another light of face. Ben rose, legs shaking, and walked to it. Inside, the world was white, blinding, sterile. A hospital room. Claire sat on the bed. Real, alive, wearing a thin hospital gown, tubes in her arm, bruises on her wrists. Her face pale, but her eyes, those defiant, brilliant eyes, were sharp. You never visited, she said, staring straight ahead. Not once. Ben's heart shattered again. "This isn't real," he murmured. "It's the house. It's—" "No," she cut him off. "This one's yours. You asked them to put me away. You said I was dangerous. You didn't even ask me why I ran. You just handed me over." Ben fell into the chair beside her, mouth dry, chest heavy. "I thought I was protecting you," he said. Claire turned to him then, slowly. Her eyes were glassy. "You were protecting yourself." Suddenly, the room shook. White cracked into red. The walls groaned. Claire vanished. And in her place, his younger self again. 13, crying in the dark. Clutching a pillow and whispering, "Please don't take her. Please don't take her." Ben grabbed his younger self by the shoulders. "I'm sorry," he choked. "I should have done something. I should have saved you both." The boy looked up, eyes hollow. "Then why did you lie?" The floor caved, and Ben fell, not into fire, not into a basement, but into stillness. He landed in a small room, square and dark, no doors, no windows. Just a chair, and a cassette recorder on a table. The tape was already rolling, and from it, his own voice, aged and cracking, spoke. "I left her. I lied. I told them I never saw anything. Because I was afraid. Because I wanted it to go away. But the house doesn't forget. And now, neither do I." Ben curled into himself as the tape played on, repeating the words. Over and over, louder each time. Until it was screaming. Until it was all he could hear. Then, silence. A final whisper. "Will you tell the truth now, Ben?" He opened his mouth, and the walls listened. The silence didn't feel like peace. It felt like punishment. It crushed the air in Ben's lungs, pressed on his chest like the invisible weight of something ancient and patient, something that had been waiting too long for him to speak. The room held its breath. No walls breathing, no flickering lights, no footsteps in the distance. Just him, the recorder, and a single question still echoing in his mind. "Will you tell the truth now, Ben?" He wanted to scream it. Yes. He wanted to shout until the walls peeled back, and the house crumbled, and every terrible thing he'd swallowed over the years finally came pouring out. But no words left his mouth. Not yet. It was as if the truth had grown roots inside him, winding around his lungs and throat, squeezing tighter every time he tried to pull it free. Because even now, even after everything the house had shown him, he still wasn't sure which truth it wanted. There had been so many. The truth he denied when Claire vanished. The truth he rewrote when their parents asked what he'd seen. The truth he buried when he watched the footage from that one gas station camera. Claire walking, looking back over her shoulder, something just out of frame trailing her in the dark. He had burned that image into his brain, then smothered it with lies. Because if she had been taken by something unnatural, then none of it was his fault. Right? But the house didn't care about fault. The house only cared about memory. The cassette stopped spinning, and the recorder caught fire. Not with flames. There was no heat. It simply began to glow, the plastic casing bubbling, melting into the table as a thick black smoke slithered up from inside. Ben backed away, shielding his eyes, but the smoke didn't spread. It pooled on the ceiling and formed a shape, thin, long-limbed, featureless. The same figure he'd seen in the cracked mirror. Still faceless, still watching. "You can't leave until you confess," it said. The voice wasn't male or female. It wasn't even a voice, not really. It was his own thoughts, twisted into speech. It sounded like guilt. It sounded like memory. Ben shook his head. "I don't know what else you want from me." The figure moved, its limbs stretching down the walls, dragging slow, deliberate paths in the suit, and then a second door appeared behind it. Tall, iron, no handle. "You know what's behind that door?" the figure said. Ben stared at it, throat dry. "No, you buried it," it continued. "That night. Before she disappeared. Before she screamed." Ben staggered back. "I didn't hear her scream." The room trembled. "You lied again." And the door opened. Just a crack. It was enough. Air rushed out of it, thick and sour, smelling of soil and rot and something unmistakably familiar. A memory he hadn't touched in 15 years slammed into him with the force of a speeding car. He was back in the hallway of their childhood home, late at night, lights off, the TV flickering in the other room, Claire's voice drifting faintly from behind the bathroom door. "Ben, are you awake?" He hadn't answered. He'd pulled the covers over his head and pretended to sleep. And then, something else. A sound he'd told himself for years was just the plumbing, just the wind. But it wasn't. It was sobbing, and another voice. Low, male. Not their father, not anyone he ever recognized. "Tell, and I'll make you disappear too." The memory shattered. He screamed, and the door flew open. Inside was her. Claire, not the shimmering vision from before, not the girl at the window. This Claire was broken, her arms twisted, eyes hollow. Face pale and bruised, mouth twitching like she was trying to speak through shattered teeth. She was chained to a wall, wrists raw, her feet hovering inches above the ground. Ben rushed to her, but the room grew longer with each step. No matter how far he ran, she stayed the same distance away. "I'm sorry!" he shouted. "I should have opened the door that night. I should have come." The shadows laughed. Claire raised her head, and in the faintest whisper, her lips moved. "Then why didn't you?" The chains snapped. The world tore, and Ben was back in the church again. The pulpit, the pews, the whispering faces. Only now, they weren't accusing him. They were waiting. Ben stepped forward, trembling. "I didn't go because I was scared," he said, voice cracking. "I didn't help because I didn't want to believe it was real. I told myself it wasn't. I told myself that if I ignored it, it would go away." He looked up. "I let her suffer." The candles blew out. The walls cracked again. This time, they didn't bleed. They opened. And on the other side, light. Soft, golden, like morning sunlight. But before he stepped through, one final voice spoke. Claire's. Real. Close. Whispering in his ear. "I've waited, Ben. But the house isn't done. It never is. There's more you forgot." Ben stepped into the light, and the door slammed shut behind him. Ben's first breath in the light wasn't relief. It was panic. The warmth touched his skin like a lie. Soft and golden, yes, but too quiet, too perfect. The kind of peace that only exists in paintings or dreams that turn sour when you blink. He stood on a path paved in white stone, stretching into a fog that glowed faintly as if lit from within. The air was still, not cold or hot, but empty, like nothing had lived here for a very long time. Or worse, like something had once and decided not to leave a trace. Behind him, the door was gone. Not closed, not hidden, gone. He called out, but his voice fell flat, swallowed by the fog with no echo to prove he was even real. The silence was not peace. It was hollow, like a world waiting to be filled with something old. As he stepped forward, the fog shifted, drawing back just enough to reveal shapes ahead, structures that shouldn't be there, a playground, rusted swings, a seesaw frozen mid-tilt, and beyond that a row of houses. Not just any houses. His neighborhood. Every detail was perfect. The red mailbox on the corner, the crooked street lamp that always buzzed when the wind picked up. Even the broken fence with the "Beware of Dog" sign that had always been a lie. But no sounds, no birds, no people. It was his childhood dissected and displayed like a memory under glass. And just ahead, halfway down the street, he saw her, Claire, sitting on the curb, head down, arms around her knees. Just like that day in July, the day their mother screamed into the phone while Ben watched cartoons too loudly. The day Claire ran from the house barefoot and didn't come back until dusk. She hadn't spoken to anyone that night, not even Ben. He moved toward her, each step slower than the last. The street stretched, the fog tugging at the edges of the world like reality was unraveling. As he drew closer, she raised her head. Her eyes weren't hollow, they were scared. "Ben," she said, "you're not supposed to be here yet. What is this?" he asked, kneeling beside her. She looked around like someone might be listening. This is what the house built for you. Your final memory. The one you never opened. He shook his head. I remember this day. You ran out crying. I stayed inside. She smiled sadly. You remember what you told yourself. That's not the same. Then the sky cracked. It didn't thunder. It didn't boom. It cracked, like glass giving way. Claire stood up quickly. You have to go before it sees you. What sees me? The thing that holds the truth together. The thing that feeds the house. It's not done with us. The swings behind them creaked. Even though there was no wind, Ben turned, and the fog began to bleed. Slow, dripping red mist curling from the corners of the sky like ink dropped into water. And from it, a shape crawled out, not walked, not ran, dragged itself. A man, or what was once a man's, skin pulled so tight over bone it looked like wet paper. Its mouth was sewn, not with thread, but with hair. Black strands wrapping its lips like a nest. And its eyes, they were eyes Ben had seen only once, in the reflection of the broken mirror. His own. It wasn't a creature. It was him. The version he never became. The one the guilt had sculpted. The version that never stopped running from the truth. The truth had grown claws. Claire grabbed his arm. It's you. It's always been you. That's the part you forgot. The house didn't twist your memories. You did. It just waited for you to stop lying. Ben stumbled back, heart thundering. The thing crawled faster now, dragging nails through the stone path, leaving streaks that hissed and steamed. The world around them began to dissolve. The houses faded, the sky pulsed, and then Claire screamed, not in fear, in warning. Remember what you heard. Ben fell. Hard. Not into a hole this time. Into sound. He was no longer on the street. He was in the hallway. Back in the real house. But smaller, shorter, 13 again. The door to the bathroom cracked open, the air heavy with sobs. Claire's voice, whispering. Ben, please. Please don't let him back in. And then, the other voice. The one that had haunted every corner of his nightmares. I warned you, girl. The door closed, and Ben had walked away. Not because he didn't understand, but because he did. He had known what was happening, and he chose to forget. And now, the house had remembered everything. Ben woke up gasping. He was in a new room. Wooden. Rotting. And he wasn't alone. Claire sat in the corner. Older. Not broken. Not flickering eye, alive and watching. She didn't speak. Didn't have to. He crawled toward her. Wrapped his arms around her knees the way she had all those years ago. And finally, he told her the truth. Ben didn't cry while he confessed. His voice was hoarse, low, almost detached, like peeling off old skin and reading what was written underneath. The words came slowly at first, then in floods. He told her about that night, about the door he didn't open, about the man whose name he never learned, whose face he never told anyone about how he watched from the hallway, frozen, as Claire begged, about how he crawled back into bed and pretended it was a dream. And when it wasn't, when the silence finally settled, he told himself maybe she left on her own. Maybe she'd come back. Maybe none of it was real. But deep down, buried in the quiet spaces of his memory, he'd always known. Claire didn't interrupt, didn't flinch. Her silence wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't anger either. It was the silence of someone who had screamed for too long and finally ran out of air. Her eyes didn't leave him. Even when the room began to shift again, the corners melting into shadow, the floor trembling beneath them. Ben finished speaking, and the house exhaled. The first sound in what felt like hours wasn't a scream or whisper, but the long, low groan of something very old relaxing its grip. The walls pulsed, slow and heavy as if they had been holding their breath through every word, and then footsteps. Not echoing, not creeping, just calm, steady, getting closer. Ben turned toward the door. It opened by itself. There stood a woman, thin, pale, dressed in black lace that hung off her like smoke. Her face was hidden beneath a veil, but her hands, long, elegant fingers tipped with crimson nails, were folded politely in front of her. She stepped into the room like a guest who had lived there far longer than either of them. Claire didn't move. Ben stood slowly, every nerve buzzing. The woman's voice was soft, but it filled the room like mist. "You remembered?" Ben nodded, barely able to breathe. "I told her everything." The woman tilted her head. "No, not everything." Ben's heart dropped. "What do you mean?" She raised one finger, pointing not at him, but at Claire. Claire finally looked away. Her eyes glistened with something new. Not grief, not fear, guilt. Ben stepped back. "Claire," her voice cracked. "I didn't just run, Ben. I went back." His blood ran cold. "What?" "The night I disappeared," she said, her words thin and trembling. "It wasn't because I was taken. I left. But the next day I came back. I didn't know if I was ready to speak. I just wanted to see if you were, if anyone was looking for me." Ben couldn't move. Claire went on, her voice hollow. "I climbed up to the attic window. I saw you, watching cartoons, laughing, eating cereal, like nothing had happened, like I'd never existed." Ben opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his throat. "That's when the house called to me," Claire whispered. "It showed me a place where people don't forget, where pain is remembered, where guilt is kept alive, and I chose to stay." The woman in black nodded. "She became the first voice the house kept," she said. "Your silence made the foundation. Her silence built the walls. Together, you made this place real." Ben stared at Claire, horror slowly folding into understanding. "You stayed." Claire looked up at him, tears streaking her cheeks. "Because someone had to remember what was done to me." The woman turned to Ben again. "The house is full now. Every lie, every shadow, every forgotten scream and dismissed memory. But it's not complete." A wall across the room slid open without sound. Behind it, dozens of doors, all different sizes, all made from different materials. Some wood, some metal, one covered in plastic, another wrapped in wire. But they all pulsed faintly. All listened. "These," the woman said, "are other truths. Other houses. Other people who built their walls with denial." Ben's voice was barely a whisper. "Why show me this?" She turned to him slowly. "Because someone must carry the memory forward. Someone who knows what silence costs." Ben looked at Claire. She nodded. "You can leave," she said. "You can leave and forget again. Or you can stay and be the one who answers the next knock on the door." He didn't speak. Didn't have to. The door behind him closed, and the house began to watch again. Ben didn't choose with words. He didn't need to. The moment his feet failed to move toward the exit, the house understood. It always did. Choice, in the McCollin house, wasn't about what you said. It was about what you did when the silence got too loud to ignore. And by standing still, by not running, by not trying to shove the weight of truth back into the dark, Ben had accepted his place. The doors ahead of him hummed now. Not a loud sound, but constant, like teeth chattering through drywall. Each one gave off a slightly different tone, as though they weren't humming, but muttering. He could almost hear words inside them if he listened long enough. Names, begging, pleading, a child crying for her mother behind the red door. A man whispering, "I didn't know, I swear I didn't know," behind the cracked white one. A woman weeping softly behind a door wrapped in police tape. Claire stood beside him, no longer flickering. Her shape was solid now, though her shadow still didn't match her form. It stretched behind her, longer than it should have, curling slightly toward the humming doors like it was reaching for them. Ben didn't ask questions. Not anymore. The house had a way of answering before you even knew what you were trying to ask. The woman in black hadn't moved. She was less a person now than a presence. Her veil fluttered without wind, her hands never unfolded. She simply nodded toward the first door on the left. "He's waiting." Ben didn't know who he was, but his hand moved before he could hesitate. The door was cold, colder than anything in the house so far. When he pushed it open, the air that met him felt like it had been buried underground for decades. The room was small. A hospital room again, but older. Dim. The walls were green, the tiles cracked, the smell, bleach and despair. On the bed sat a boy, maybe 11, skin pale, eyes locked on the floor. His wrists were wrapped in gauze, and the machine beside him beeped softly, a flat rhythm that might have been mistaken for peace. Ben stepped inside. The boy didn't look up. Claire's voice was suddenly beside him again. This one's different. He didn't forget. They did. Ben moved closer. The boy's lips moved, barely. "I told them," he said. Ben crouched beside the bed. "Told them what?" The boy looked up. His eyes weren't scared. They were angry. "I told the teacher. I told the counselor. I told everyone." His voice cracked with the strain of having been silenced too many times. "But they said I was making it up. That my dad was a respected man. That I was confused. That kids lie." Ben swallowed hard. What did the house do? The boy smiled for the first time, but there was no joy in it. It listened. The walls of the room groaned. Ben stood as the bed began to decay before his eyes. The boy remained still, unblinking. Even as the mattress turned to ash and the walls pulled inward like a closing throat. Claire grabbed Ben's hand and pulled him back through the door, slamming it shut just before a gust of freezing air burst out. Ben turned to her, breath hitching. "That was real," she nodded. "They all are." "How many?" She looked toward the hallway of doors. "Too many." The woman in black was already gliding to the next one. Ben hesitated. "I thought this was about me. About what I forgot." The woman turned her veiled face toward him. "You were the beginning. The crack in the wall." The moment memory splintered and the house found its voice. Ben felt the truth of it without needing proof. "So now what? I watch." "No," she said. "You listen." Door by door, Ben entered other lives. A girl locked in a basement, carving stories into the walls with her fingernails. A boy forced to apologize to the man who hurt him, told by his family that forgiveness was godly. A woman whose cries for help were smothered beneath a community's silence because the man who hurt her coached their children's soccer team. Each room was a chapter of someone else's life that had been buried beneath doubt, silence, shame. And the house had remembered them all. Some of the rooms weren't violent. Some weren't filled with screams. Some were just empty. Places where someone had been forgotten. Where no one came home. Where birthdays passed uncelebrated. Where grief turned into dust. The kind of pain that didn't shout, it waited. And in each one, Ben didn't speak. He just stayed. Listened. Sometimes the person in the room would see him. Sometimes not. But each time, when the door closed behind him, the humming in the hallway would grow softer, as though the house had been holding its breath and was finally, slowly, beginning to let go. Claire kept count, not with numbers, but with looks. After the 27th door, she didn't say anything, just stood at the end of the hall where a door larger than the rest loomed. It was black, bone black, no handle, no seams. Just a single word carved into it, us. Ben walked toward it. He didn't knock. He didn't need to. It opened. The room inside was a mirror, not covered in mirrors, not made of reflective glass. It was a mirror. Every surface, every inch, and in every reflection, Ben and Claire. At different points in time, laughing, fighting, sharing secrets, sitting side by side at a funeral, running through sprinklers, her wiping tears from his face, him watching her leave, all versions of them that once existed. All of them shattered into loops, trapped moments reflected infinitely. In the center of the room, a chair. Ben sat. Claire joined him, and the house spoke, not with a voice, with understanding, that this was no longer just about guilt, or even memory. It was about keeping the forgotten alive. And through the silence, something else began to grow. Hope, not loud, not blinding, just present, like a seed planted in a place no one thought to check. As the door shut behind them, the house didn't hum, it listened. It had been hours, or maybe days. The McCollin house didn't count time the way the outside world did. It measured moments by weight, how heavy the silence became, How thick the guilt hung in the air, how deeply a memory was pressed into the floorboards. Ben didn't know how long he and Claire had sat there, side by side in that impossible mirror room, watching flickers of themselves play out endlessly across the glass. But when they finally turned to face the door again, something had shifted. The hallway beyond had changed. The endless row of humming doors was gone. No more whispers through the wood. No more shadowed figures locked behind their secrets. Now there was only one door ahead. It was small, wooden, with peeling paint and rusted hinges, familiar. So familiar that Ben's throat tightened. It was his bedroom door. From the house they grew up in. Claire touched his shoulder gently. "You ready?" He wasn't. Not even close. But he nodded anyway. The handle turned with a weak groan. The room beyond wasn't filled with horror. No blood. No broken memories. No dripping walls or flickering lights. Just a boy, him, again, 13 years old. Sitting on the edge of the bed, arms wrapped around his knees, staring at the floor like it had the answer to a question he didn't know how to ask. Ben stepped in first. The boy didn't react. Claire lingered by the door, watching quietly. Ben sat beside the younger version of himself. There was a long pause. No dramatic confrontation. No sudden flood of visions. Just two versions of the same person sharing space for the first time. "I hated you," Ben said softly. "For years." The boy blinked, slowly. "I told myself you were weak. A coward. That you turned away from her because you were scared." The boy didn't move. Just stared at the floor. "But you weren't," Ben whispered. "You were a kid. You didn't have words for what you saw. You didn't understand how deep it went. You tried to survive the only way you knew how, by forgetting." A long silence followed, and then the boy finally spoke, barely audible. "I didn't forget." Ben turned his head sharply. "I remembered," the boy said. "Every day. I just never said it out loud. Not even once." The weight of that truth hit Ben harder than any scream the house had ever thrown at him. Because it wasn't the forgetting that had fed the house. It was the silence. The years of carrying it, of letting it rot inside. "I'm sorry," Ben said. "You didn't deserve that." The boy didn't answer, but something in his face relaxed. His shoulders dropped. The tightness in his jaw loosened. He didn't vanish or turn to smoke. He simply stood up and walked out of the room. Claire followed, and for a moment, Ben was alone. He looked around the room once more. The posters on the wall, the half-drawn comic on the desk. The stuffed bear Claire had given him when he was 6. It had always sat at the edge of the bed, untouched after she disappeared. Now, it sat in the boy's chair, arms stretched open like it was waiting for someone to come home. Ben reached out and hugged it, and for the first time in years, he let himself cry like a child. When he stepped out of the room, the hallway was gone. No walls, no house, just a field, open sky, sunlight. Claire was there, barefoot in the grass, face lifted toward the breeze. She looked peaceful. "Real?" He walked to her. "Is this it?" he asked. She nodded. "For now." Ben looked back. There was no door, no house, just the quiet. "You stayed here all this time," he said. "Why?" Her smile was soft, sad. "Because someone had to remember. Someone had to hold the pain until it could be shared." Ben looked down. "Then it's my turn now." She turned to him, tears shining in her eyes. "You don't have to." He met her gaze. "I know. But I want to." She took his hand, and the silence around them changed. It wasn't heavy anymore. It breathed. Like something that had waited long enough was finally allowed to exhale. Far off in the distance, the house stood once more, smaller now, quieter, but still there, watching, listening, remembering, not to haunt, but to hold. Because now, someone was inside, who wouldn't let the voices fade. The field didn't fade like a dream. It unraveled, one thread at a time, quietly, painlessly, until the breeze died and the golden sky folded into gray. Ben barely noticed at first. He was still holding Claire's hand, still watching the place where the house had once stood like a wound in the earth. But as the light dimmed, he felt something shift beneath his feet, a coldness creeping up through the grass like roots awakening. He looked at Claire, and her eyes told him what he already suspected. "It doesn't let go," she whispered. "Not forever." Behind them, the air cracked open. No thunder, no warning, just a slow, wet tear in the sky, peeling apart to reveal the familiar silhouette of the McCollin house, rising like a memory you never meant to find. It hadn't changed much, still broken, still wrong. But now it stood in a place it hadn't before, between the field and the unknown, as if to say, "You've walked this far. Might as well come in." Ben didn't flinch. Claire let go of his hand. "I can't go with you," she said. His throat tightened. "Why not?" "Because I never left. Not really. I belong to the house. I'm the whisper that keeps the doors from rotting. I'm the story it tells when no one's around to listen." Ben stepped closer. "Then I'll stay, too." She shook her head gently. "You're not mine to keep anymore. You're needed somewhere else." He frowned. "Where?" A pause. Then she said something that made the world tilt. "They're coming." The air around them rippled. The wind returned, sharper now, more deliberate. And in the distance, shapes. People. Dozens. Some walking slowly. Some staggering. Some dragging memories behind them like chains they couldn't break. Some looked young. Others old. All of them moving toward the house. Ben's breath caught. "Who are they?" Claire's voice was smaller now. "The ones who lied. The ones who were lied to. The ones who forgot. And the ones who never had the chance." He stepped back, watching them grow closer. Their faces clearer. A man clutching a bloodied notebook. A girl with no shoes, hair matted with ash. A teenager wrapped in police tape. A woman in her 20s, carrying a bag of children's drawings. None of them spoke, but all of them looked at the house with eyes that knew pain. Ben turned back to Claire. "What am I supposed to do?" Her expression softened. "Answer the door." And just like that, she was gone. Not torn away, not swallowed. Just absent. Like a song ending in the middle of a note. Ben stood alone. The grass turned to dust beneath him. The field shriveled into darkness. And the McCollin house stood taller now, hungrier, watching him with every cracked window, every warped shingle, every crooked step. It wasn't alive, but it wasn't dead either. It was ready. Ben walked toward it. The crowd behind him didn't speak, but he could hear them. The whispers. The memories. The truths buried so deep that only a house like this could dig them back up. When he stepped through the door, it didn't groan. It sighed, like it had been waiting for him. Like it had finally, found someone willing to listen. Inside, the light was dim, warmer than before, less hostile, but still thick with the scent of memory. The portraits on the wall had changed. No longer faceless, no longer cracked. They were his memories now, and theirs, each one moving, shifting, like a living museum of guilt, and sorrow, and silence. Ben walked past the hallway where the mirrors had once reflected his worst fears. Past the basement door that hummed with the sound of truths not yet confessed. Past the room where Claire had once stood with her stitched mouth and hollow eyes. At the end of the hall was a new room, one he had never seen. Small, bare, just a chair, and a bell on a table. He sat and waited. The first knock came within minutes. 3 soft raps, a girl's voice. "Hello. Is anyone there?" Ben pressed the bell. The door creaked open, and the house listened. It always would. The house had never been this quiet. Not in all the moments Ben had spent wandering its crooked halls, not in the hours he had spent peeling back. Memories like old wallpaper. It was the kind of silence that wrapped around the bones and pressed against the lungs, not suffocating, but reminding. A silence that didn't come from stillness, but from expectation. As though the house was waiting for something to break. Ben sat in the chair. The bell on the table beside him sat untouched for a while, even after the first knock had come and gone, the door creaking open into nothing. The girl hadn't entered. She'd peeked in, eyes wide and glassy, then turned away as if she wasn't ready yet. That was the rule. The house didn't force them in, it simply opened. It offered, and now Ben waited again. No clocks ticked in the McCollin house. But time passed all the same. He could feel it in the shifting air, the way the walls seemed to lean in when it grew late, the way the shadows stretched longer than they should. The next knock came 3 hours later. This one was harder, desperate. A man's voice, deep but breaking. Please, I just want to forget. Please let me forget. Ben didn't ring the bell this time. He stood, walked to the door, and opened it himself. The man stood on the threshold, drenched in something that looked like rain, but smelled like smoke. His coat was torn, his eyes bloodshot, his hands clutched a photograph so tightly the edges had cut into his skin. Ben didn't ask what brought him. The house already knew. The man looked at Ben like he was seeing someone who'd already been where he was going. "You live here?" he asked. Ben shook his head. "No, I listen here." The man stepped in slowly, cautiously, as if afraid that moving too fast would make the walls collapse. His steps echoed softly, and the moment he passed the threshold, the door closed behind him. The house adjusted. It always did. The hallway stretched, making room. A new corridor unfolded to the left, one that hadn't existed a moment before. No pictures, no windows. Just a dull pulse in the walls like the thrum of a distant heartbeat. The man walked toward it without being told. Ben sat back in the chair. He didn't need to follow. Some rooms didn't want visitors, and some confessions could only be made alone. He waited again. The silence swelled and softened, like a deep breath pulled into the ribs of the house. Somewhere above, wood cracked, not in warning, but in welcome. Something had opened, a memory dislodged, a truth finding its place. Then another knock, this time softer, tentative. He rose again and opened the door. A boy stood there, no older than 9, no shoes, shirt torn, holding a plastic toy in one hand and nothing else. His eyes were wide, but not frightened, curious. He looked past Ben into the house and tilted his head. "Is this the place where you find the pieces?" Ben frowned. "What pieces?" The boy held up the toy, missing an arm. "The ones people don't want anymore." Ben crouched beside him. And suddenly he wasn't talking to a child. He was talking to a memory, one that had waited too long to be remembered. The boy didn't come from a single story. He wasn't born from one night of violence or a decade of neglect. He was the shape of all the things children are forced to leave behind. Safety, comfort, innocence. And he was here, standing barefoot on the steps of a house made of the very things people try to bury. Ben opened the door wider. The boy entered. And the house gave him a room with no name. Not every guest had a story that could be told in words. Some simply needed to exist again. Ben lost track of how many knocks followed. A woman who brought with her the smell of antiseptic and bleach. Trailing hospital bracelets that clinked when she walked. A teenager who had no mouth in the mirror, who stared at her own reflection and whispered lies she'd been told until they became true. An old man who asked if he could leave his name at the door. "I don't want to carry it anymore," he said. It belonged to someone else. Ben never turned anyone away. He couldn't. Because every person who knocked on the door reminded him of Claire. Every whispered confession echoed the moment he chose not to listen. And every step they took inside the house made it grow. Not larger, but deeper. The house didn't need more rooms. It needed more memory. Because in forgetting, these people had built walls around themselves. And in remembering, they tore those walls down. But the house didn't just hold memory. It kept it. Preserved it like a photograph submerged in glass. Not to be fixed. Not to be solved. But to be witnessed. And Ben, once a boy too scared to knock, too ashamed to speak, too numb to scream, was now its witness. Not a prisoner. Not a savior. Just the first to say "I remember" out loud and mean it. The next knock didn't come for days. But when it did, Ben knew this one would be different. Not because of the weight behind it, but because it sounded like home. The knock wasn't louder than the others. It didn't shake the walls or echo down the corridor like thunder. But it hit differently. The sound was soft, 3 firm taps. Yet it landed in Ben's chest like a held breath. He didn't know he'd been carrying finally escaped. It wasn't just a knock. It was recognition. A sound that didn't ask for permission, but returned like a memory that refused to stay buried. Ben rose slowly from the chair. Something about the air had changed. Not colder, not warmer. Denser, heavier with meaning. The silence around the house bent inward, as though the very walls were listening more intently now. As though the knock had woken up something deeper inside the house, something older. He reached the door, but his hand trembled before touching the handle. He already knew who was standing on the other side, and he wasn't ready. He opened it anyway. She stood there, hair longer than he remembered, a little paler, thinner maybe. But it was her. Not the flickering specter he'd seen in the mirror rooms. Not the guilt-formed version stitched together by the house. Her. Claire. But not as she had been in the house's grasp. As she had been before. Before the attic. Before the silence. Before the forgetting. "Hey," she said. Ben tried to speak, but nothing came out. Claire looked past him into the entryway. "I figured, if the door's still open, maybe I could come in." He nodded, stepped aside. She walked through the threshold like she belonged there. Because she did. The house didn't groan or creak. It didn't adjust or expand. It simply accepted her. The way the walls seemed to still for just a moment made Ben wonder if maybe, just maybe, the house had always been waiting for this. She walked with quiet purpose down the hallway, her fingertips grazing the old wood paneling like she was checking for cracks in memory. Her eyes scanned the familiar frames, the etched names in the wall, the flickering rooms that occasionally coughed out laughter or screams. But she wasn't afraid. Ben followed. She turned the corner into the old room. The chair was still there, the bell, the table. But now, a second chair had appeared beside it. Waiting, she sat. Said nothing for a while. "Then you've been doing this alone?" Ben nodded. "Someone had too." Claire leaned back. "I didn't know you'd stay." "I didn't either," he admitted. "At first, I thought I was making up for what I didn't do. Then I realized I wasn't just staying for you." She smiled faintly. "You were staying for them." He nodded again. Silence settled between them. Not uncomfortable, not punishing, just real. She glanced at the door. "Do you know who's coming next?" Ben shook his head. "The house knows. I just opened the door." She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out something small. A key. Old, rusted, worn smooth on one side. She placed it on the table between them. "I found it in one of the rooms," she said. Didn't know what it opened. Ben stared at it. The key looked familiar. Too familiar. He picked it up, and the moment his fingers touched the metal, a sound rippled through the house. A low, humming breath, like wind rolling through a hollow. The hallway behind them changed. New doors appeared. Not the kind lined with trauma or shadow. These were different. Smooth, quiet, peaceful. Claire stood. "You've done enough," she said. "But this part you shouldn't do alone." Ben looked at her. "What part?" She nodded toward the new hallway. The return. As they stepped into it, the air grew lighter. Every step felt like a weight sliding from Ben's shoulders. These were rooms not of pain, but of closure. The first held a woman embracing a version of her daughter she'd never gotten to know. The next, a man placing a letter on an empty table and whispering a name he hadn't spoken aloud in 40 years. Further down, 2 boys sat together on a porch, one alive, one not, both crying without shame. Ben didn't open the doors this time. Claire did. He watched her with quiet awe. The way she spoke gently, the way she stepped in without hesitation, the way each person looked at her like she'd been waiting for them all along. And maybe she had, because the house didn't just listen anymore. It guided, it healed, or at least it tried. When they reached the final door, Ben stopped. It was made of glass. Behind it, a room that looked like their childhood kitchen. And their mother stood inside, alive, smiling, cooking something on the stove. She hadn't looked that whole in years. Not since Claire disappeared. Not since Ben stopped speaking. He turned to Claire. She nodded. "You need this." Ben stepped through. His mother didn't react at first. Then, slowly, she turned. Her eyes filled with tears the moment they met his. She opened her arms. And Ben, a man full of ghosts, a boy who had once sealed his own voice behind fear, walked into her embrace and finally, cried like a son. The house didn't whisper. It didn't moan. It stood quietly, as a home should. The kitchen smelled like cinnamon and coffee, just as it had on quiet Saturday mornings before the world had shifted under their feet. Before the attic, before Claire's silence, before Ben learned that forgetting was easier than breaking. The sunlight streaming through the window wasn't the sickly amber of the house's twisted past. It was warm, real, alive, and for a fleeting moment, Ben wondered if he'd finally escaped the weight of memory, or if the house was giving him a moment of mercy. His mother didn't ask where he had been. She didn't question why he looked older, why his shoulders hung heavy with something invisible, why his voice caught like a rusted hinge when he said her name. She simply held him, like nothing else mattered, like she'd been waiting on the other side of every closed door he'd refused to open. Her hands were thinner than he remembered, but strong. Steady. Ben held on longer than he meant to. Long enough to remember the last real hug they'd shared. It was at Claire's funeral. An empty casket. A church that echoed with whispers. A mother who cried without sound. He had pulled away too soon then. Now he didn't. When they finally parted, his mother smiled. Not a wide grin, but a soft curl of her lips that said more than words ever could. She went back to the stove, humming a lullaby she used to sing when they were small. He didn't recognize the words, but the tune pulled something loose inside him. He sat at the old table. The house outside the kitchen was still, not silent in the way it once had been, tight and smothered, but restful, as though it was sleeping. The air didn't hum with guilt. The walls didn't pulse with dread. It felt like an old man finally closing his eyes after years of pacing the same hallway. Claire appeared in the doorway. Ben hadn't noticed her enter. She leaned against the frame, watching their mother with a calmness that only came from being seen. Really seen. "Is this real?" Ben asked, not turning his head. Claire didn't answer right away. "Then it's ours." Ben nodded. That was enough. They stayed in the kitchen until the coffee burned and the sun shifted across the floor like a golden clock. When Claire finally moved, her feet made no sound. She reached for their mother's hand, and though she said nothing, the gesture pulled a single tear from their mother's eye. Then Claire turned to Ben. "It's time." He stood without asking where they were going. The house, ever watchful, had already opened a path. A narrow stairwell descending into soft darkness. Not the choking black of the basement, or the attic's suffocating void, but something gentler, like dusk under thick blankets, like the closing of eyes after a long day. Ben followed her down. The walls here were bare. No doors. No memories. Just silence. Not heavy. Not tense. Just silence. Claire spoke first. "Do you remember the treehouse?" He smiled. "The one you pushed me out of. You fell. You shoved me." She laughed. It echoed faintly, but the sound didn't bounce back haunted. It warmed the walls. "It's still up," she said. "In the yard behind the real house. The boards are rotting. One of the steps snapped when I tried to climb it." "You tried to go back?" She nodded. "Last year. Just for a second. I stood in the driveway and stared at the door." "Did you knock?" "No." He understood. There were some doors you never approached again. At the bottom of the stairwell was a single room, empty. No light source, and yet it wasn't dark, just soft. Ben looked around. "What is this place?" Claire didn't speak. Instead, She knelt in the center of the room and placed her hand flat against the floor. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the ground below her hand began to shift. A small square of wood lifted, like a hidden compartment. Inside was a box, unmarked, locked. Claire slid it toward Ben. He stared at it. "What is this?" "You." He knelt beside her. "I don't remember putting this here." She met his gaze. "You didn't. You buried it." He hesitated, then opened it. Inside, photos, drawings, a bracelet, a letter, a bloody ribbon, a piece of a doorknob, fragments. Objects from rooms he'd walked through, memories he thought he'd only seen, not lived. Each piece pulsed faintly. Claire's voice barely broke a whisper. "The house never gave you their pain, Ben. It showed you your part in it." He stared into the box. All those rooms, all those doors, all those people. He hadn't just witnessed them, he'd held them. In small ways, subtle ones. The moments no one ever noticed. The friend he didn't call back. The girl he laughed at in front of others and never apologized to. The boy he saw being dragged into a car by someone who wasn't his father and did nothing. Claire closed the box. "You can't carry it forever." Ben looked up. "Then what do I do?" "Give it a home." He looked around. The room was empty, but the house was waiting, not for confession, not for penance, but for care. Ben stood, walked to the center, and placed the box on the floor. He stepped back, and the room inhaled. The walls absorbed the sound. The floor softened. The house adjusted, not with cracking wood or screaming hinges, but with a breath of gratitude. Then a door appeared behind them, simple, new. No memories attached, no shadows whispering behind it, just a door. Claire stepped forward. Ben grabbed her hand. She squeezed it once, then let go. "I'm not going through that one," he said. Claire paused. "Why?" "Because someone's going to knock," he said, "and I still have work to do." She smiled. A real one this time. Then she opened the door and was gone. Ben turned back to the stairwell, and as he climbed, the house began to stir, gently, like it was waking up, not to haunt, but to listen again. The house was awake again, but different this time. Its walls no longer pressed inward, suffocating like they had when Ben first arrived. Now they felt spacious, stretched open by stories too heavy to contain. There was still darkness in the corners, but it didn't reach for him anymore. It simply existed, like a room that hadn't yet been visited. He moved through the corridors with steady feet, no longer flinching at every whisper, no longer expecting the house to punish him. That part was over. The house had what it wanted from him. Now, it wanted to begin again. Ben passed through the entryway where he used to sit with the bell on the table, that old wooden chair now empty. The hallway beyond had changed. It was no longer endless rows of doors waiting to be opened. Now, the doors revealed themselves only when needed. The house wasn't hungry anymore. It was curious. It had stopped pulling ghosts from beneath the floorboards and started listening for the ones still walking above them. He moved toward the west wing, a part of the house he hadn't dared explore until now. It had always felt too cold, too brittle. But the door stood open today, no humming, no sighing. It simply waited. Inside was a long hallway with white walls, clean and untouched. But each time he stepped forward, the air seemed to carry a sound, a soft repetition, like the creak of footsteps and the distant echo of children laughing through a closed window. Ben knew what this was. Not a memory, not a confession, but a reminder. The house was showing him what it could have been, what any home should have been. It wasn't all horror inside these walls. It wasn't just pain echoing through the rooms. There had been joy here once, somewhere. There had been laughter, even if it had been brief. The structure wasn't evil. It had simply remembered what the world made it forget. At the end of the hallway, another door waited. This one was unlike any he'd seen before, painted white, nearly glowing, with handprints all across it, tiny and large, smeared and smudged, layered over each other like a mural of lives touched and forgotten. It didn't hum. It didn't whisper. But as Ben stood before it, he could feel something pressing against the other side. Not something dark. Not something monstrous. Something new. He pushed it open. Inside was a room full of echoes. That was the only way to describe it. The furniture was made of words. Chairs shaped by apologies never spoken. Shelves lined with things people wished they'd said. A table of unsent letters. Windows made of silences between arguments. The walls shimmered with ghosted laughter, conversations that had drifted into nothing. Everything in the room had been said, once, but never truly heard. Ben stepped in, feeling the weight of 1,000 voices wash over him. The voices weren't scary. They weren't even sad. They were unfinished. This was the room for those who hadn't found the courage to knock. The ones who still sat on the edge of their own beds, wondering if their pain was real, if their stories mattered, if anyone would ever believe them. Ben sat at the center of the room and whispered into the air, "I'm listening." And the echoes shifted, not into screams or wails, but into clarity. One voice rose above the rest, young, barely more than a child. "I'm scared to tell anyone what happened. What if they don't believe me?" Ben answered, "I believe you." Another voice, older now, he said, "It was my fault." And I believed him. "Ben, it wasn't. And I'm sorry you had to carry that alone." The air shimmered. A voice full of rage, she said she loved me. Then she left. What does that make me? Ben, it makes you someone who trusted and got hurt. That doesn't make you weak. The room lit up with every response. The walls breathed, and the house opened, not with force, but like a heart easing open after years of being clenched. Doors appeared, but these were different. They faced outward, as though they led not deeper into the house, but back into the world. Ben realized then, the house was no longer just a place for keeping pain. It was a place for transforming it, for taking what had been broken and holding it long enough for it to be seen, for giving people the space to speak aloud what they had only ever whispered into their pillows. He stood, walked through the room, touching each object gently. A chair carved from the phrase, "It wasn't that bad." A lamp made of your overreacting. A torn notebook full of "I didn't know how to help." These were the things that had built walls inside people. And now, the house was breaking them down. Ben left the room, walked back through the house, past rooms that had once screamed at him, that now greeted him with silence, with peace. When he reached the entryway again, he found the chair had vanished, and in its place, a bench, long enough for two, and a second bell. Someone else would sit there someday. Someone else would answer. He turned back to the door, put his hand on the knob, and smiled, because now, the house wasn't just a place made of memories. It was a home made of echoes finally heard. The doorknob was warm beneath Ben's palm, not from sunlight or heat, but from something more intimate, presence. The house didn't push him out. It didn't lock him in. It simply waited, as it always had, with that quiet expectancy of a breath caught between heartbeats. A moment that asked, without words, "Are you ready for the next one?" And in that stillness, Ben realized something strange. He was. The door creaked open with a soft exhale, not unlike a sigh through old lungs, and beyond it lay not another hallway, not a new chamber of memories or nightmares, but a single stretch of shadow and wind. A narrow road, dirt-packed and familiar, weaving through tall, colorless trees that reached toward a sky the color of old bruises. Ben stepped through, and the door behind him remained open, not as an invitation back, but as a tether, a promise. The path wasn't lit, but he didn't need light. This wasn't a place for seeing. It was a place for feeling. Each step down the road echoed softly, the kind of echo that didn't bounce off walls but sank into the ground. He walked for what felt like minutes, maybe hours, until the wind picked up and brought something with it, a sound, thin and trembling. A heartbeat, not his. It pulsed through the dirt, faint but steady. Slow. Deep, it was a living sound, and it guided him like a compass without direction. Every footstep brought him closer to it, though the path never turned. That's when he saw the clearing ahead, wide, open, empty, except for the thing at its center. A well. Rough stone ringed in moss, mouth agape, yawning into the earth. The heartbeat was louder here, but not coming from the well. Not exactly. It came through it, from deeper. Like the pulse of something beneath the ground that remembered every name ever whispered into its mouth. As Ben approached, the wind died entirely and the trees stilled. The silence was not empty. It was waiting. On the lip of the well sat a wooden box, identical to the one Claire had shown him, but this one had no lock. Ben opened it. Inside, a pair of shoes, small, mud-caked, one of the laces tied in a perfect loop, the other knotted in a frantic tangle. Next to them, a crumpled drawing, stick figures, one larger than the others, with a sad face and the word sorrow scratched beneath in block letters, and a cassette tape. He stared at it. His own handwriting on the label. For Ben. When you're brave enough. He didn't remember making it. Didn't remember writing those words. But he knew they were his. The wind returned as he pressed play, static. Then a voice, his own, younger, terrified. Don't forget what you saw. Don't forget what you didn't say. If you do, it'll grow. It'll live in you. It'll turn into something worse. The voice trembled. If you're hearing this, it means you forgot anyway. A pause. I'm sorry I wasn't stronger. Ben swallowed hard, chest aching. The heartbeat below quickened, as if stirred by the sound. It matched his own now, rising in sync. The voice continued, calmer now. But if you remembered, if you came back, then maybe you're ready to give it back. The tape clicked. Ben stood in silence, holding the shoes. They were his brothers. The one no one spoke of. The one lost in a lake. Not an accident, but a moment. A choice. Not to save him. Not to call for help. Just to wait. To stand still and pretend it hadn't happened. Because fear and shame moved faster than water. The well stared back at him, unblinking. Ben dropped the shoes inside. Not to erase, not to forget. To return. To give the pain back to where it came from, so it didn't have to live inside him anymore. As the shoes disappeared into the dark, the ground trembled. The trees shook, and the sky cracked open, not with storm but with sound. The sound of hundreds of voices whispering the same thing over and over. We remember, we remember, we remember. Ben dropped to his knees, not in weakness, but in release, and the heartbeat slowed, not to silence, but to peace. When he rose again, the well was gone. The box was gone. Only the path remained, and at the end of it, another door, not back to the house, not to a room, but to a porch, a real one, wooden, familiar. Ben stepped through it and found himself standing at the front of a house he hadn't seen in years. Not the McCollin house, his house, the one they'd lived in as kids, the one with peeling paint and a swing that creaked even on windless days. He turned. No door behind him, no well, no road, just sky, and the echo of a promise the house remembers until you do. Ben stepped inside. And for the first time, he wasn't afraid of what was waiting. The door creaked open not like a warning, but like an old friend clearing its throat. Familiar scents drifted out. Damp wood, laundry detergent, a trace of cinnamon from a long, forgotten holiday. Ben stepped inside slowly, his eyes drawn to the worn wallpaper, the scuff marks along the baseboards, the framed photos hanging slightly crooked along the hallway. Nothing had changed, and yet everything had. This wasn't a reconstruction built by memory. This was the real place, the house where it had all started, where forgetting became survival, where silence became inheritance, where every locked door wasn't protecting them from something outside, but holding something in. He moved through it like a stranger in his own skin. The furniture was the same. The placement of shoes by the door, the ticking clock in the living room that always lagged 2 minutes behind. The photographs on the mantel. Claire, himself, their mother, but not their father, not even in the background. That, at least, had been scrubbed clean. Ben touched the edge of one frame and felt the ghost of warmth, like the memory inside it still breathed. In the photo, Claire was mid-laugh, sunlight catching her hair just right. His own face beside her was frozen in a half-smile, one eye squinting, the other already scanning for something out of frame. Even then, he'd been waiting for the moment to break. He moved down the hallway toward the door that had always stayed shut. It wasn't locked. It never had been. But it may as well have been bricked in by silence. His brother's room, the one no one entered after the lake. Ben stood before it now, hand trembling slightly over the knob. He could feel it pulsing like a nerve beneath his skin. Not fear, not even guilt, but resistance. As if every part of him had been trained not to remember this room. The well had shown him the shoes, the cassette, the truth. But this was where the forgetting had taken root. He turned the handle. The room was small. Sunlight filtered in through dusty blinds. The bed was still made, sheets faded but untouched. A stack of comic books on the nightstand. A toy robot, missing one arm, sitting on the windowsill like it had been waiting for someone to come home. It was a tomb. But not one made of grief. One made of avoidance. Ben stepped inside, and the air shifted. Not temperature. Weight. Like the moment he crossed the threshold, the room remembered him. There was no sound. No voices, just a pull. A drawer in the desk sat slightly ajar. Ben approached, his hand moving before his mind could catch up, and opened it fully. Inside, a journal. Not his. His brother's. He hadn't known it existed. He flipped to the first page, and what he saw made his legs give. "I don't think Ben likes me." 10 words. Written in pencil. Shaky, uneven. A child's fear pressed into paper. Ben sat on the bed, the journal heavy in his lap. He turned the pages. Entries about being left behind. About following Ben into the woods and getting lost. About falling into the lake and not being able to swim, and how Ben didn't move. How he just stood there. "I don't think he meant to hurt me." One page read, "But sometimes it feels like I'm already gone." Ben covered his mouth, but the sob broke through anyway. He'd never known. He'd never let himself know. The lake had taken more than a life. It had stolen a chance at forgiveness before it was ever asked for. And for years, Ben had told himself it was an accident, that he was frozen, that he was too young to understand. But the journal said otherwise. He had understood just enough to walk away. To not tell anyone his brother had followed him that day. To bury the sound of the splash beneath every lie he ever told himself. He read every page. Then read them again. Until the ink smudged under his fingers. Until the room no longer felt like a stranger's. He stayed there for hours. And when he finally left, the air was lighter, not because the guilt had vanished, but because it had been seen. The hallway welcomed him back. And at the far end, another door stood open. Claire. She didn't speak. She just looked at him. And then nodded. And for the first time in his life, Ben realized something he'd never dared believe: the house wasn't cursed. He had been. By silence. By fear. By forgetting. But not anymore. He walked to her, took her hand, and stepped through the door. Not into another memory, but into morning. The light wasn't blinding. It didn't rush in with a holy crescendo or peel back the sky like a curtain of gold. It arrived slowly, quietly, like someone whispering your name after you'd nearly forgotten what it sounded like. The door closed behind Ben and Claire without a sound, and in front of them, daybreak, real and untampered. Not the illusions the house had conjured before. This was the world as it was, raw, honest, flawed. They stood on the back porch of their childhood home. The swing, still hanging from rusted chains, swayed gently in the windless air. Beyond it, the treehouse peeked through the thinning canopy, its ladder missing 3 rungs, the roof caved slightly inward. Birds moved through the sky, distant but present, like the world was resuming a rhythm it had once paused for their grief. Grass rose in tall, uneven tufts around the yard. The fence leaned where it used to stand proud. Time had continued without them, but not against them. Claire let go of his hand. She stepped into the yard, barefoot, each footfall flattening dew-covered blades, making a path that shimmered faintly in the low sun. Ben followed her, slower, unsure whether this place would accept his weight. But the ground didn't crumble beneath him. It held, like it recognized him, like it knew what it meant to carry a boy who had once stood at the edge of the world and walked away from the truth. Claire stopped at the treehouse. Her fingers traced the wood, her eyes scanning the names they'd carved as kids. Ben and Claire. Forever explorers. The letters were shallow now, weather-worn, half swallowed by the bark. She smiled. I used to think if we could just stay up here forever, nothing bad could reach us, she said, voice soft, like we could outrun everything if we climbed high enough. Ben remembered that too, the long afternoons hiding in the treehouse, pretending they were pirates or spies or travelers lost in time. Anything but two kids waiting for someone to come home angry. Anything but two shadows trying not to breathe too loud. But we always came down, Ben said. Claire nodded. We had to. Make-believe only lasts so long. He climbed up beside her. The wood groaned under his weight, but didn't break. Inside, it was smaller than he remembered. Or maybe he was just bigger now. The old notebook was still in the corner. The one they'd written in. Drawings, lists of monsters, promises they made. He flipped through it. One page had just 2 lines. If we ever forget who we are, we'll come back here. And we'll remember together. Ben closed the notebook. Claire looked at him. And he asked the question he'd held in his chest since the moment he opened the first door in the McCollin house. Are we free now? She didn't answer right away. Then, gently, we're awake. And that meant something more, because freedom suggested escape. Awakening suggested presence. The house wasn't gone. Not fully. He could still feel it, like a ripple somewhere behind the clouds. Like a story that hadn't ended, only paused. It had let them out because they'd faced what it was built to hold. And now, it was waiting. For someone else. For the next knock. Ben climbed down first. His hands still remembered the shape of the branches, the way to twist his heel on the last rung to avoid the nail that once cut him open. Claire followed. The world around them didn't bend or melt. It just was. They walked to the edge of the yard where the woods began. The path that had once led to the lake was overgrown now, but it was still there, just hidden. Ben hesitated, then stepped forward. Claire stopped him. You don't have to go back. He turned to her. I know, but someone might. Because, even though they were awake now, the world was still full of people sleepwalking through their own pain. Still full of children who hid in closets and basements and under blankets, hoping someone would hear the silence they couldn't put into words. Still full of houses that didn't scream, but listened, and waited. Ben walked the path to the lake. It shimmered in the light, perfectly still. There was no ghost waiting for him, no body rising from the depths, just water, reflecting the sky, reflecting him. He crouched at the edge, not to mourn, to promise. I'll hear them, he whispered. All of them. I'll answer every knock. I'll open every door. A single ripple passed through the surface like a sigh, and then, from behind him, another knock. Not on a door, on him. A small voice, timid. Is this the place where people talk about the things they're not supposed to? Ben turned. A boy stood there. Young. Eyes rimmed red but dry. Holding a note. Ben nodded. Yeah, this is the place. The boy looked at the water, then back at him. Can I stay a while? Ben smiled. We've got time. And as they sat at the edge of the lake, the morning opened wider. Not into closure, but into beginning. They sat in silence, Ben and the boy. The kind of silence that didn't demand anything but presence. The sun rose higher, brushing the lake's surface with lazy streaks of gold that made the water look like melted glass. The trees rustled softly, not in warning, but like whispers traded between old friends. It was the kind of morning that didn't announce itself. It arrived slowly, patiently, waiting for you to notice it. And Ben noticed everything. The boy beside him clutched the folded piece of paper tighter, his small hands shaking just enough to be seen, but not enough to be acknowledged. Ben didn't ask about it. Not yet. This was the moment before the moment, the fragile breath before a truth is spoken. Break it too soon, and everything might scatter. After a while, the boy unfolded the note. It was crumpled, edges torn, smeared with dirt and something darker. He didn't hand it to Ben, just laid it flat between them. Words scrawled in blocky, trembling handwriting, "It's my fault. I wanted to tell, but I didn't." And then it happened. Ben didn't flinch. He didn't reach for the note. He simply looked at it. Let it breathe in the space between them. "I thought it was my fault too," Ben said eventually. His voice was low, even. The kind of tone a person uses when sharing something sharp and old. "For a long time, I thought if I'd said something sooner, if I'd done one thing differently, none of it would have happened. And then I hated myself, because I didn't want to remember what I had done." The boy looked at him for the first time. Not just glanced, looked. His eyes were dark, alert, cautious, but beneath that hope, like he hadn't expected to be met with anything but more silence. Like this was the first time someone had truly heard the echo he'd been carrying. Ben continued, "But guilt is tricky. It makes you think remembering is punishment, that telling the truth will ruin everything. But really, silence is what does that. It's what keeps the doors locked." The boy's lip quivered. "What if they don't believe me?" Ben turned fully to face him. "I believe you." His shoulders collapsed just slightly, the way someone might after holding their breath too long. The paper between them fluttered in a breeze that came from nowhere. Ben picked it up gently and folded it once, twice, 3 times, then placed it in his pocket, not to hide it, but to carry it. "That's the first step," he said. "You said it? Now it doesn't live alone." The boy looked out at the lake. "Is this the house?" Ben thought about that. Thought about the walls, the whispers, the rooms made of memory. About the way the house had shifted and grown, how it had listened until it bloomed. "No," he said. "This is what comes after the house. This is where the house leads you when it knows you're ready." The boy was quiet for a while. Then he asked, "Does it ever go away?" "The guilt?" Ben shook his head slowly. "No, not completely. But it gets lighter when you talk, when someone listens, when you tell the truth enough times that the lie loses its shape." The boy stood, looked back toward the path. "There are others." Ben stood too. "I know. They're scared. I was too." The boy nodded. "Should I tell them it's okay to come?" Ben smiled, his throat tight. "Tell them the door's open." He watched the boy vanish into the trees, his steps light, his shadow long. And Ben stood at the edge of the lake a while longer, the weight of that crumpled note still warm in his pocket. Not a burden, a reminder. Behind him, the breeze shifted. He turned to find the house again. Not the McCollin house, but something new. Smaller, simpler. A single room, a porch, a door that was already cracked open. Inside, not mirrors or screens. Just 2 chairs, a kettle on a stove, a window that looked out over the lake. Ben walked toward it. This was the place where people came to speak what had always been locked inside. A home made for whispers. And now, he was its keeper. By the time the next knock came, the sun had climbed high, casting its light across the doorway like a promise. Ben opened it. A woman stood there, eyes red, hands shaking, and in a voice smaller than hope, she asked, "Is it okay if I don't know how to begin?" Ben stepped aside. "You just did." Ben didn't keep track of how many people came through the door. Not because it didn't matter, but because numbers felt wrong in a place like this. Each knock wasn't just a visitor. It was a history, a weight, a story with jagged edges that didn't always bleed but always ached. Some people brought bags, some brought nothing. Some came weeping. Others didn't say a word. A few collapsed just inside the threshold, too exhausted to explain what they were running from. Ben didn't ask. He waited. Sometimes they talked, sometimes they didn't. Sometimes they just sat by the window and stared at the lake until the light changed and their breathing slowed. The house, this new house, had grown a rhythm all its own, not like the McCollin house, which throbbed with buried grief and pulsed with forgotten screams. No, this house was quiet, watchful. It offered instead of demanded. A fire that warmed but didn't burn. A roof that sheltered without locking. It was, in every way, the opposite of the house that had broken Ben open. But it too listened, and it was listening now as a new guest arrived. She didn't knock. She didn't need to. She stood in the doorway with her fists clenched at her sides, her jaw tight, shoulders wound like a spring. A teenager. 16 maybe. Her hoodie was too big, sleeves torn at the cuffs. Her eyes. They were the kind of tired you don't get from sleepless nights, but from trying too hard to forget. Ben met her at the door, said nothing. Her mouth opened, closed, then opened again, as if her voice was a bird trapped under her ribs, too bruised to fly. Finally, she asked, "Is this where you go when the world tells you it didn't happen?" Ben stepped aside. She entered without looking around. Didn't take off her shoes. Didn't ask where to sit. She dropped into the chair by the window like her bones no longer believed in standing. Her breath hitched, but no tears came. Some people had cried themselves dry long before they ever arrived. Ben sat across from her, gave her time. That was the currency here. Time without pressure. Eventually, she spoke, eyes still locked on the lake. "They said I changed, that I was making it up, that I just wanted attention. Even my best friend," she stopped texting back. Ben nodded. "I stopped eating. I stopped sleeping. I stopped talking." And no one noticed. Ben didn't interrupt. He let the silence settle gently. "Sometimes I wonder," she whispered, "if it would have been easier if something had been broken, if I had bruises or scars. But instead, I just had memories and doubt." Her hands trembled. Ben reached into the drawer beside his chair and pulled out the notebook. He slid it toward her without a word. On the cover, a simple phrase, "For the ones who can't speak yet." She looked at it like it might bite. He waited. Eventually, she opened it. Inside were pages filled with different handwriting. Short entries, long ones, some rambling, some just names. But all of them had one thing in common. None of them tried to explain away their pain. They simply existed. She read page after page, her breath hitching more each time. Then finally, slowly, she took the pen from the spine and turned to an empty page. She didn't write much. But what she did write made Ben's chest go tight. "I don't remember what happened first, but I remember the silence that came after." She set the notebook down gently, like it had become something holy. Ben asked, "Do you want to say anything out loud?" She shook her head. "Do you want me to say it for you?" A long pause. "Then just sit with me." He did. They watched the light change on the water. The house made no sound, but something in the walls shifted. A warmth, like hands unfolding. A softness in the air. This was what the house was built for now. Not revelations, not hauntings, but room, for breath, for pause, for lives that had never been allowed to unfold without fear. The girl stayed until sunset. She left the notebook on the windowsill, open to her page. Before she walked out, she turned to Ben. Her voice was steadier, firmer. "Thank you for believing me without proof." Ben nodded. "Belief isn't something you earn," he said. "It's something you're owed." And as the door shut behind her, the house seemed to exhale again. Less of a breath, more of a promise kept. That night, Ben walked the halls. Not to check on anything, just to feel them. They didn't shift or bleed. They didn't trap or confuse. They held. That was enough. Because sometimes the bravest thing a person can do isn't screaming the truth or reliving the past. Sometimes it's simply saying, "I'm still here, and in this house." That was all it ever asked. Days passed quietly in the house, each one carrying its own rhythm. Soft footsteps, hushed whispers, quiet meals eaten at tables meant for sharing. It wasn't always easy, but it was always real. There were no mirrors here that twisted reflections, no walls that pulsed with hidden grief. Instead, there were rooms filled with quiet acceptance, corners where someone could sit unnoticed until they felt ready to be seen, windows that caught sunlight just right, as if the house itself was learning how to hold light again. Ben had become accustomed to the rhythm of these days, but something new stirred the air one evening as the sky turned from lavender to deep blue. He was sitting by the window, waiting, not for anyone in particular, just for whatever the house might need next. That's when he heard it, a soft knock, hesitant. Like it wasn't sure if it wanted to be answered. He rose and opened the door. A woman stood there, older, maybe in her 60s. Her eyes were deep and tired, her hair streaked silver, and she held a worn photograph tight in her hand. She didn't ask if she could come in. She didn't need to. Ben stepped aside, and she moved past him silently, each step measured and slow. Carrying a weight she'd been holding far too long, she sat in the chair nearest the fireplace, hands trembling just slightly. Ben sat across from her, giving her room, letting silence fill the space between them until she was ready to break it. Eventually, she set the photograph down between them on the table. It was faded, curled at the edges, showing two smiling children standing near a bicycle, one older and taller, one small and bright-eyed. "My brother," she said softly. Her voice was worn like the photograph. "He went missing when we were kids. We searched for days, then weeks. But eventually, everyone stopped looking. They said he probably ran away. But I knew he wouldn't have." Ben didn't speak yet. He watched her carefully, sensing the story was not finished. She drew a shaky breath. "I found something." A few days after he disappeared, his jacket hidden behind the neighbor's shed. Torn dirty, like someone had tried to bury it. She looked at Ben directly now, eyes wide with a truth she'd never shared. "I never told anyone. I was scared of what I'd found. Scared no one would believe me, scared of the answer. So I kept quiet, and I hid the jacket deeper." She glanced down again at the photo. "Now I don't have proof. I only have this memory, buried under years of silence." Ben leaned forward slightly. "You don't need proof here. This place isn't about evidence. It's about speaking the things that never got heard." She looked at him, relief breaking gently across her face like dawn. "I always thought silence protected me. But it only made everything heavier. Silence can be safety," Ben said softly, "until it becomes a cage." She nodded slowly, running her fingers over the photograph. "I've carried this for 50 years. Afraid to say it out loud. Afraid if I spoke, the truth would take something from me. But now, sitting here, I feel lighter." She stayed for hours, recounting memories. Not just the painful ones, but others, too. Moments of laughter, of joy, of simple sibling fights and inside jokes. The house listened, the walls holding her voice gently, storing each memory carefully like something precious. When she finally stood to leave, she hesitated at the door. "What happens now? Does the memory stay here?" Ben shook his head gently. "No, it stays with you, but lighter now. Because someone else knows. It's no longer trapped in silence." She smiled faintly, stepping back into the evening. As the door closed behind her, Ben felt the quiet deepen around him, not emptily, but in a comforting way. A space waiting patiently for the next person who needed it. That night, as Ben moved through the rooms, he noticed something had shifted again. A new hallway had appeared, soft and dimly lit. Curious, he walked down it until he reached a single door, slightly ajar. Inside, there were no echoes or whispered confessions. Instead, the room held a simple bed, neatly made, a small table, and shelves lined with dozens of photographs. Not painful ones, not twisted reminders of loss. These were the small, quiet moments. The laughter at birthday parties, quiet afternoons reading books, days spent walking without fear. Each image was carefully framed, preserved gently, without judgment or burden. This was where memories came to rest, not forgotten, not buried, but gently held. Ben stepped out, closing the door softly behind him, understanding now that this house wasn't just for speaking truths. It was for sheltering them, too, for offering a safe space where silence was no longer a punishment, but simply a peaceful pause. And as he walked back to his room, the quiet followed him gently, filling each hallway and room, not as emptiness, but as something tender, careful, and forgiving. This was the house that gave back what silence had taken away. Not every day brought someone new to the door, and Ben had grown used to that. There was no rush here, no urgency, no ticking clock pressing down on his shoulders. The house moved through its days gently, not marking time by calendars, but by moments, how long a person needed to sit quietly, how deep a breath someone took before finally speaking, how soft the sigh that followed letting go of something heavy. This house wasn't a place that demanded answers. It simply held them until someone was ready to speak. But tonight was different. Tonight, as Ben sat at the kitchen table, a cup of tea cooling between his hands, something stirred softly at the edges of the quiet. The rooms seemed to stretch slightly, as if preparing for something. Ben didn't move, didn't hurry. He waited until he heard footsteps outside, soft and hesitant, pacing just beyond the porch. He opened the door before they knocked. Outside stood a man, middle-aged, his shoulders stooped, his face partially hidden beneath a worn hat. His posture said exhaustion, his clenched hands spoke anxiety, but his eyes, they showed something deeper, something he hadn't allowed himself to speak yet. Ben stepped back silently, giving space. The man hesitated, then crossed the threshold, moving slowly, as though afraid something fragile might shatter beneath his steps. He sank into the nearest chair, removing his hat, turning it nervously in his hands. He didn't speak immediately. Ben waited, letting the silence hold him carefully. Eventually, the man's voice came, barely louder than breath. "I watched it happen," he whispered. "Years ago, across the street. I saw the bruises on her arm, the way she shrank when he came home. I heard the yelling, but I closed my curtains. I told myself it wasn't my business." His voice broke, the weight of unsaid words finally pressing against him. "One night, she ran to my door. She knocked, begged me to open up, and his voice cracked. I pretended I wasn't home." Ben didn't interrupt. The silence allowed the words to echo gently, safely. "I never saw her again after that. They moved away, but I've carried it ever since. The guilt, the wondering. I keep hearing her knocking, even when it's quiet." The man's shoulders trembled slightly. Ben reached forward slowly, placing a hand lightly on his wrist. "You've carried her story alone," he said gently. "Now someone else carries it with you." The man looked up, eyes glassy. "Does it ever go away?" Ben shook his head softly. "Not completely. But telling it, sharing it, it lets the burden breathe. It becomes part of your story, not all of it." The man stayed late into the night, telling more, small details, regrets, the weight he had hidden behind everyday routines. The house held each word, each confession, not judging or forgiving, simply accepting them as truth. When the man finally rose to leave, he stood straighter, lighter. At the door, he paused, turning back. "What do you call this place?" Ben considered for a moment. "I think it's just called a beginning." The man nodded slowly, stepping into the dark, leaving behind the quiet of his confession. Ben closed the door gently, breathing deep the silence that now felt lighter, freer. He moved toward the back of the house to the small, quiet room he had discovered earlier. The one filled with photos and gentle memories. He paused, noticing something new. A photograph had appeared quietly on the shelf. A woman smiling softly, a scarf loosely around her shoulders, sunlight behind her. The woman the man had spoken about, the one who had knocked at his door so long ago. The house hadn't forgotten her. Neither had Ben. And now, Neither had the man who had carried her silently. Ben knew then that this place wasn't just for people to speak truths, but for memories to find rest, to find guardians who would hold them gently, quietly, forever. And tonight, as he turned out the lights, Ben understood his own role clearly. He wasn't just listening. He was a quiet guardian, watching over these truths, holding space until they were ready to move on, no longer buried but gently remembered. As he climbed into bed, he heard the house breathe slowly around him, peaceful, gentle, and ready to welcome whoever knocked next. Ben woke before dawn, not from a sound, but from the gentle tug of something familiar, something the house was trying to show him. He rose quietly, his feet padding silently through hallways still asleep. The walls breathed softly around him, holding the calm of the night. The air carried no threat, just a gentle nudge, a careful pull guiding him upwards. The attic door stood slightly ajar, something he hadn't noticed before. It didn't feel like a warning this time, nor like a haunted whisper from the past. Instead, it felt like an invitation, a quiet promise that this space had something left to say. He climbed slowly, the steps creaking gently beneath him. The attic was dimly lit by the first gray hints of morning seeping through gaps in the old wood. Dust particles floated slowly in the pale light, suspended like tiny fragments of memory waiting to be caught. At the far end of the attic, Ben noticed a small trunk, partially hidden beneath a dusty cloth, one he hadn't seen before. He moved toward it carefully, kneeling down to gently lift the cloth. The trunk was old, the wood worn and darkened by age. His fingers brushed the latch, hesitating only a moment before lifting it open. Inside lay a collection of objects, small, everyday things that at first seemed unremarkable. But Ben knew by now that nothing in this house was without meaning. He picked up a small, faded notebook first, its cover soft and worn. Inside were careful sketches, drawings done by a steady hand, a child's hand, each one carefully labeled with a date and initials. Beneath it, folded carefully, was a delicate lace handkerchief, embroidered with initials he didn't recognize. Beside it lay a pocket watch, stopped permanently at 3:15. Each object felt gentle, like memories someone had carefully tucked away, not out of shame or fear, but because they were too precious to lose, too fragile to share carelessly. But at the bottom of the trunk was something that made his heart catch, a small wooden carving. It was crude but tender, carved by someone inexperienced yet deeply earnest, two small figures holding hands, unmistakably children. On the base were initials he recognized immediately, B and C. He held the carving in his hands, turning it slowly, feeling its warmth seep into his skin. He remembered carving this with Claire, sitting outside beneath the big tree in their backyard. They'd promised never to lose it, to keep it safe, a small token of trust and friendship in a world that felt unstable and unpredictable. But it had been lost, forgotten, until now. As Ben sat with the carving in his hands, he felt the air shift gently around him. Not cold, not threatening, just calm, steady. The attic seemed to breathe slowly, deeply, as if acknowledging what he'd found. As if telling him it was finally safe to hold this memory again. He carefully replaced the other objects in the trunk, leaving only the carving in his hand as he descended the stairs. Outside, dawn had fully broken, filling the house with soft, golden light. He moved toward the window, looking out across the lake. It was calm, reflecting the sky like a mirror, peaceful and steady. He placed the carving gently on the windowsill, watching as the sunlight caught its edges, casting gentle shadows. He understood now why the attic had called him, not to revisit old pain, but to remind him that even quiet, simple memories mattered deeply. They didn't always scream or whisper in agony. Sometimes they waited quietly, patiently, for the right moment to be remembered again. And as he stood there, sunlight warming his face, he knew something else clearly now. The house had begun to trust him not just with pain, but with tenderness too. It was no longer just a guardian of grief. It was a keeper of quiet joys, small connections, soft memories that might otherwise slip away unnoticed. Later that morning, when another gentle knock came at the door, Ben moved to answer with calm assurance. He knew he wasn't just letting people in to confess pain, but welcoming them into a space that remembered everything: laughter, grief, fear, love, and held it all gently. He opened the door. A young woman stood there, her expression uncertain yet hopeful. "Is this where you come when you're ready to find something you lost?" she asked softly. Ben smiled gently, stepping back to let her enter. "Yes," he said, "it is." That evening, as dusk draped the house in deep amber and blue, the air shifted again, but not like before. This wasn't the house guiding Ben gently or opening another quiet door. No, this was something deeper, something older, something that had been lying beneath the surface all along, biding its time. The silence had changed. Not louder, heavier, like it had absorbed too many stories and could no longer hold them still. Ben noticed it first in the hallway, a draft brushing past his ankle, though every window was shut. He turned, thinking maybe someone had entered unnoticed. But there was no one there. Only the portraits along the wall, some real, some perhaps imagined by the house, and beneath one he'd passed dozens of times without ever really looking at it, he heard a faint sound. Not whispering, not breathing, scratching. He moved closer, heart slow but steady, until he could see that the bottom edge of the wall, just beneath the frame, had been disturbed. The wallpaper was curled back, torn along the seam, exposing old wood beneath it. Not the bones of a haunted house, but the skin of one trying to speak. He peeled it back carefully. There, scratched into the wood beneath the paper, were words. Jagged, desperate, itld shambutydidntr. Ben stepped back slowly. This wasn't someone's confession left behind. This was a repetition. A statement someone had written not once, but over and over, layered atop itself, a message chiseled in silence because the spoken word had failed them. He reached out, tracing the letters lightly with his fingers, and beneath the first message, he found another line, fainter. "If you see this, you're listening." A shiver ran through him, not from fear, but from the gravity of it. This house had heard more than cries, more than regret. It had absorbed the weight of forgotten voices. And now, it was showing Ben the places where those voices had clawed to be remembered. He checked every hallway that night, behind picture frames, inside closets, beneath rugs, and each time he found more. "She said I was lying. They closed the door. I screamed, but it was quiet. I only wanted someone to stay." The walls had become a graveyard for unsaid truths. Not ghosts, memories. Some were decades old, written in chalk or blood or rust. Some were fresh, barely etched. Like the house had been adding to its collection even after Ben had arrived. He didn't sleep that night. Instead, he sat in the center of the hallway, surrounded by these voices. He didn't try to erase them or fix them or offer platitudes. He just read. He let them pour through him. Let them be heard, maybe for the first time. By morning, he had a plan. He moved through the house with purpose, collecting brushes, paint, wood panels. He began to cover the walls, not to hide the words, but to give them space. He traced each message carefully, painted over them with soft colors, preserving the shape of the letters in gentle contrast. He turned the hallway into a corridor of truths, a gallery of the unheard. When Claire returned that afternoon, she stopped in her tracks. She looked at the walls, at the dozens of voices now blooming in quiet color, and said nothing for a long time. Then, quietly, "You turned them into something that can't be buried again." Ben didn't reply. He didn't need to. The house was different now. Not just a place to tell your own story, but a place to hear the ones left behind. That evening, another guest arrived. A young boy, no older than 8, clutched tightly to his mother's hand. He said nothing as they entered, his eyes wide, scanning the room like he expected something terrible to reach out from the shadows. Ben knelt down, eye level with him. "It's safe here," he said gently. The boy didn't respond, but his gaze drifted toward the hallway, toward the words lining the walls. His fingers loosened slightly on his mother's hand. He walked forward, slow and uncertain, until he reached a panel that read, "I was scared and no one saw it." He stopped there. He stared at it. Then, for the first time since walking through the door, he whispered, "Me too." And in that moment, something passed through the room. Not a breeze, not a breath, but something softer. A quiet relief, like the house exhaled the sorrow it had carried for too long. Ben stood behind the boy, not speaking, simply sharing the silence. This was the new purpose of the house. Not to chase shadows, but to give them a name, a space, a voice. And slowly, gently, the silence began to sound like peace. Rain had begun to fall softly, a quiet rhythm against the roof that sounded less like a storm and more like a lullaby the sky was humming for the earth. The house welcomed the rain without complaint. Its wood, its windows, its bones. Everything seemed to lean into the downpour, as if the house itself remembered what it meant to be comforted. Ben walked slowly through the front parlor with a cup of tea in hand, listening to the drops trace their way down the glass, like fingers dragging memories down the spine of the house. He hadn't planned on revisiting the far room. It had stayed closed for weeks. No knocking, no creaking floorboards, no whisper beneath the door. But that evening, something shifted. A faint scent curled out into the hallway. Cedarwood, old pages, and something else. Something familiar. It wasn't a warning. It was a memory calling softly. He approached the room, his footsteps muted by the thick rug beneath him. The door, once warped and swollen with years of silence, opened easily this time. No groaning, no resistance. Just a quiet sigh as the hinges turned. Inside, the air was still, thick with something that felt almost sacred. The room was smaller than he remembered, or maybe it simply felt smaller under the weight of what it held. This was the first room he had stayed in when he arrived. The one he had woken up in after leaving the McCollin house. It was bare then. Now it was anything but. The bed was made with crisp, folded sheets. The walls, once blank, now wore memories like paintings, some drawn in charcoal, some painted in gentle watercolors. Faces, mostly. Hands reaching. Eyes watching, shoulders pressed together in tentative trust. And at the center of the room, on the small desk, lay an open book. Not a journal. Not one of the notebooks the guests sometimes wrote in. This was different. It was a ledger of sorts. Each page bore a name. First names only, no dates. No notes, no commentary. Just names. Ben flipped through, his own hands trembling slightly with the weight of what he was holding. He recognized some. Lena, the woman who had found the strength to remember the knock she never answered. Toby, the boy who hadn't spoken until he saw the wall of unheard words. There was Maya, who whispered her story into the fireplace so the ashes could carry it somewhere safe. But then he saw names he didn't know. Names that hadn't walked through the front door. Names that hadn't ever stood before him, eyes red, hands shaking. These were people the house remembered for itself. People who had spoken in other lifetimes, or maybe never at all, but who had existed in the long stretch of quiet the house had endured before Ben arrived. And then, near the end of the book, he found something else, a blank page. But beneath it, faintly indented as though someone had written, and then erased it, was his own name. Ben, not written in his hand, written to him. He traced the letters, and as he did, something bloomed at the base of his throat. Not fear, not guilt, but a sudden, overwhelming understanding. The house had always known him, even before he arrived, even before the McCollin house, even before the forgetting. It had been waiting, not just for someone to keep its rooms open, but for him, specifically. Because he was made of the same quiet, the same broken stories, the same kind of memory that didn't scream but ached. He closed the book gently, as if afraid the names might scatter if he let go too fast. Then he sat down at the desk, and for the first time since the house had let him in, he picked up a pen. He didn't write a story. He didn't write a confession. He wrote his name on the page where it had once been erased. He claimed it. And beneath it, he wrote a sentence that made his hands stop shaking. I am still here. The rain fell harder now, but it no longer sounded like sorrow. It sounded like a hymn. Ben stood and looked around the room once more. The bed, the sketches, the book, everything was where it needed to be. But something had changed, subtle, almost imperceptible. The room didn't just look familiar. It felt like it had been built from his own breath, and maybe it had. Maybe the house had always been piecing itself together from the broken parts of the people it tried to save. Maybe that was the secret. The house didn't heal you. It remembered you, until you were strong enough to remember yourself. He closed the door behind him softly, a reverence in the motion, as though he was tucking something sacred back into place. The hallway welcomed him with gentle quiet, and he knew this wasn't the end of the story. Not even close. Because somewhere out there, people were still searching, still forgetting, still whispering truths into locked rooms, hoping someone might hear. And this house, his house, was listening, and waiting, and remembering, just like him. It started with the absence of sound. Not just quiet, but absence. No footsteps. No creaking floorboards. No wind brushing gently against the window panes. It was a silence that didn't rest on the house. It pressed into it, filling the space between walls, curling beneath doorways, settling across rooms like dust that had nowhere left to fall. Ben woke in the middle of that silence, heart already beating faster, not from fear but recognition. Something was different. Something had entered the house, not loudly, not violently, but like a shadow slipping into a dream already halfway forgotten. He stepped out of bed without turning on the light. The hallway was darker than usual, the kind of dark that absorbs more than it reveals. The air was still, too still. As he passed the corridor of painted voices, the ones etched into the wall, he could feel it. The pressure of something watching, something waiting. The words painted there didn't stir. They sat heavy and silent, like they too were holding their breath. Ben's instincts didn't scream. They whispered, urging him forward toward the front of the house. He didn't see her at first. She was already inside, standing at the far end of the living room where the fire had long since burned to embers. She didn't knock. She didn't speak. She simply stood there, her back turned, head tilted slightly as if listening to something only she could hear. Her hair was soaked, her clothes darkened by rain. But there hadn't been rain that night, not since the day before, and there were no wet footprints behind her. Ben didn't ask how she got in. He simply said, "You're here." She turned slowly. Her eyes were empty, not in the hollow sense, but in the full one. Filled with something too vast, too old, too painful to carry alone. She looked at him as though he were not a stranger, as though she had been walking toward this moment her entire life. "Do you remember me?" she asked. Her voice was low, not broken, not bitter, but ancient, as if it came from somewhere deeper than time. Ben shook his head. "Should I?" She smiled, but it wasn't joy. It was sadness dressed in recognition. "I remember you," she said. "You didn't hear me then, but you will now." Something in the walls shifted, not creaked, shifted, like the house itself leaned in. "I spoke first," she said, "long before anyone else did. But the house was young then. It didn't know how to hold my words. So they slipped, and fell, and disappeared." Ben took a step closer. "What did you say?" "I told it what he did," she whispered. "And the house, it listened, but it didn't know how to help me. So it swallowed the story instead, and now it lives here. In every door that won't close, in every shadow that won't stretch right, in every cold breath that doesn't belong." She reached into her pocket and pulled something out. A necklace. delicate, frayed, the chain broken. She held it up, and in the firelight it glinted faintly, just enough for Ben to see the initials engraved into the charm. C.W. Clare. Ben's breath caught. The woman smiled again gently. Not her, she said, reading his expression. Before her. The first Clare. The one who was never remembered. He didn't understand. Not fully. But the house did. A door opened behind them, slowly, with reverence. Not just a door to a room. A door to the house's beginning. The woman turned toward it. She called to me, she said, because the pain repeats itself, over and over. Different names, same silence, same closing doors. Ben followed her through the door. The room on the other side wasn't familiar. It was old. Older than anything he'd seen in the house. The furniture was warped, half rotted. The windows fogged from the inside. On the walls, drawings. Not words, pictures. Sketches of a girl, again and again, always with the same hollow eyes and broken necklace. She had drawn herself in, over and over. Ben moved closer to one of the drawings. In the corner, in tiny writing, "Please remember me this time." He turned to the woman. "You said I didn't hear you then. When was that?" Her eyes shimmered. "Before the house. Before the forgetting. Before you chose silence." His chest tightened, not from guilt, from recognition. A buried shape in the dark. A voice he had once dismissed. A truth he had stepped over because it was too much to carry. And now it had come home. The woman set the necklace on the table gently, as if putting down the last piece of a long, unfinished puzzle. "I just needed to be seen," she said. And in that moment, the silence in the house broke, not with sound, but with presence. The temperature shifted. The air grew warmer. The walls no longer pulsed with the strain of unsaid things. It was as if the house had been holding its breath for decades, and now, finally, it exhaled. The woman turned to leave, her face softer, her shoulders lighter. But before she passed through the doorway, she touched Ben's hand. "You don't have to carry me," she whispered. "Just don't forget me again." He nodded. Words failed him. But his silence this time wasn't avoidance. It was acknowledgement. A promise. The door closed behind her. The house settled. And Ben stood in the middle of the room, now filled with the echoes of someone who had never been allowed to stay. A room that had finally remembered its first story. And now, because of her, it would never forget another. It came to Ben in a dream. Not a nightmare, not exactly. But the kind of dream that sits just close enough to truth to be dangerous. He was walking through the house, except it wasn't the house he knew. The walls stretched longer, the windows blinked like tired eyes, and every step he took sounded like it came from someone else's feet. He descended staircases that didn't exist, turned corners that folded in on themselves, and finally arrived at a door that pulsed. Not with malice, but with memory. A door that knew him. When he awoke, the image stayed behind like an aftertaste: black wood, a rusted knob, and a single, scratched word carved near the bottom. Beneath. Ben didn't wait. He dressed quickly, moving through the familiar rooms with deliberate quiet. Like he didn't want to wake the house. But it was already awake. The air hummed faintly, not unsettling, but charged. As he walked through the hall near the back, something shifted underfoot. A hollow sound beneath a rug he'd never thought to move. He peeled the rug away slowly, revealing old floorboards, one of which had a faint groove running along its edge. A trapdoor. There were no hinges. No handle. Just that same word etched roughly into the wood beneath. Ben pressed his fingers into the seam, and the floor groaned as it lifted, dust curling into the air like held breath. A narrow staircase descended into the dark. Not a basement, something older, more forgotten. The air grew cooler as he descended, but not cold. It felt preserved, like he was entering a part of the house that had been sealed to keep something safe, not out of fear, but reverence. When he reached the bottom, he found himself in a circular chamber, lined wall to wall with shelves filled not with books, but boxes. Dozens, maybe hundreds. each identical, each marked only by a single name. He walked the room slowly, fingers grazing the spines of boxes like they were sacred texts. Lena, Toby, Maya. Names he knew. People who had come through the door above and left pieces of themselves behind. But then, he found one marked Claire. But not the Claire he knew. There was another, and another. So many Claires. And not just them. Names that repeated, shifted slightly in spelling. Names that sounded like echoes of each other. Ben opened one box, carefully. Inside was a small bundle of paper. Notes, drawings, a lock of hair, a child's ribbon, and a photo, blurry aged, almost melted by time. A little girl. Laughing, he picked up one of the notes. He told me not to tell. But I want to. I want to so bad it hurts. Please don't let him find me first. Ben's hands shook, not from fear, from recognition. He realized what this place was. It wasn't a room of storage. It was a room of holding. Every box, every single one was a story someone wasn't ready to speak aloud. A memory too raw. A truth too dangerous to breathe above ground. And the house, this house, had been keeping them safe. Until their owners were ready. That was why some people came and didn't remember what they were looking for. Because the house remembered for them. He reached for another box, one without a name. The tag had fallen off, or maybe had never been written. Inside was a child's drawing, a house, 2 figures, one with a red X across it, and scribbled on the back, "Don't let him come back." Ben stumbled backward, the weight of it sinking into him like stone. This was deeper than he thought. The house didn't just heal. It hid. It hid the parts of people too painful for them to carry. It offered a place where those pieces could wait, not rot, not disappear, but wait, patiently, like children curled in closets waiting for the storm to pass. He looked around the chamber, at all the names, all the truths, all the whispered warnings and dreams and wounds. And then he saw a box on a high shelf, higher than the others, alone. He climbed the ladder slowly. When he reached it, his heart stopped. It had no name, but it had a symbol, a carved B, the same one he used to etch on his school notebooks, the same shape he'd scratched into the wood fence as a boy when he was angry, when he needed to feel in control. His fingers hovered above it. He didn't open it. Not yet. Not tonight. He descended slowly, replaced the trapdoor, and stood once more in the house that now felt impossibly larger. The room beneath the room wasn't a secret. It was a promise, a sacred vow that no truth would ever be lost here. Only held until its owner was ready to take it back. And as Ben walked the hallway again, the floor felt different. Not like something to be walked on, but like something alive, something listening. Ben didn't touch the box again for 3 days. He walked the house, spoke to new visitors, kept the fire alive, changed the linens, made tea, comforted strangers, and all the while, the memory of that nameless box loomed in the back of his thoughts, like a blinking light behind a closed eyelid. It was his. He didn't know how he knew, but he did. The moment he'd seen the crooked B carved into its wooden face, something inside him had shifted, something long buried had stirred. Not violently, not urgently, but insistently. It wanted out. It rained on the 3rd night, harder than before. The house didn't tremble. Nothing ever did anymore, but the wind outside pulled at the corners of its frame, as though trying to remind it of how easily things used to fall apart. Ben sat at the edge of the bed, fingers clenched around the blanket, eyes locked on the ceiling, listening to the water hammer against the roof. When the first drop of cold sweat ran down his back, he stood and went to the attic door. He didn't stop to question himself. He didn't bring a lantern. He walked by memory, one foot in front of the other, down the main hallway, through the narrower passage, behind the linen cupboard, and into the space where the trapdoor waited. The rug was already pulled back. The wood breathed under his fingers as he lifted it. The stairway sighed, and there it was again, that low, steady hum, the room beneath the room. He descended slowly, candle in hand this time, letting its flame draw shadows across the curved walls of memory and loss. He passed box after box, some familiar, some forgotten, some holding the shape of wounds that hadn't spoken in decades. He didn't read their names. Not tonight. He walked directly to the shelf, the high one, the lonely one, and stared up at the box that bore his mark. It waited without moving, without pulling him forward, without tempting him. But it called, just the same. He took the ladder rung by rung, hands steady, eyes sharp. When he reached the top, he placed the candle on the edge of the shelf and ran his fingers along the box's surface. The wood was smoother than it looked. The bee was jagged and carved deep, not by a craftsman, but by a child in a moment of anger or fear. There was no latch, no lock, just a lid. And yet it wouldn't open. Ben tried gently at first, then firmly. It didn't budge. The box wasn't resisting out of malice. It simply wasn't ready. Or maybe he wasn't. He sat there, cross-legged on the narrow wooden beam, candlelight flickering on his face. He didn't speak aloud. There was no one to listen. But in the quiet, his thoughts moved like slow tides. He remembered small things at first. A toy he used to keep hidden in the back of his dresser drawer. The way his mother used to double, check if he'd locked the windows, even on the hottest nights. A scrape on his knee from a fall he didn't remember taking. Then the memories sharpened. The time he'd woken up in the middle of the night with blood on his pillow, and no idea where it had come from. The way his father never looked him in the eye when someone brought up that week. The day he was asked to forget something, and he had. Or at least, he thought he had. That was when the box clicked. Not loudly. Not like a lock giving way. Just a small, soft shift in the grain of the wood. He looked down. The lid had risen just slightly. Enough to open it. But his hand wouldn't move. He sat still for a long time, feeling his pulse echo through his spine. He wasn't afraid of what was inside. He was afraid of what wasn't. Because if he opened that box and found nothing, if there was no horror, no secret, no explanation, then the heaviness he'd carried all these years would be his alone. Unjustified. Unspoken. Ben reached forward and lifted the lid. The candlelight flickered. Inside was a drawing, folded once. He opened it slowly. Crayon, blue and red. A house. A man. A small boy standing on the roof. The boy's eyes were two black circles, his mouth a line. Above him, scribbled in oversized letters, Da and Kam, Biaske and Ansadi. Ben stared at it for what felt like hours. His breath was shallow, his face numb. He didn't remember drawing this, but he knew it was his. The page smelled like something old and sour, mildew and rage. Beneath it, there were only two more items: a small, broken action figure, melted across the chest, and a slip of paper torn from a spiral notebook. One sentence. He said, "If I tell, no one will believe me because I lie when I'm scared." Ben folded the paper again, slowly. He placed it back in the box, closed the lid, and descended the ladder in silence. The house was watching, but not intrusively, with concern, with readiness, with understanding. Ben sat on the cold floor and held the box in his lap for a long time. Not crying, not shaking, just holding it, like a wound that no longer bleeds, but still burns. It wasn't about what was inside anymore. It was about the boy who had needed to lock it away, and the man who had finally come to get him back. That night, Ben placed the box on the mantel in the common room, beneath the framed painting of the lake. He didn't label it. He didn't hide it either. It was no longer about forgetting. It was about witnessing. He didn't need to tell the story yet, but the house knew. And now, so did he. The house had grown quieter, not empty, but hushed, like it was waiting for something it couldn't name. Ben felt it in the way the walls no longer creaked with movement, but sat completely still, as if holding their breath. For 3 nights, no one came. No knock on the door. No footsteps on the porch. No whisper in the hall. Just silence. But not the kind that offered peace. This silence pressed in from all sides, thick and unmoving, like fog in a dream that never lifts. On the fourth night, the temperature dropped without warning. Not enough to see his breath, but enough to feel the bones in his hands ache when he reached for the kettle. The fire crackled in the hearth, trying its best to fight whatever pressed in from beyond the windows. Still, Ben couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was already inside. He moved through the rooms, slow and quiet. Every candle flickered when he passed. Every mirror showed only his reflection except one. The hallway mirror, the one framed in twisted wood at the far end near the guest rooms, shimmered differently tonight. At first, he thought it was the firelight playing tricks, but the room behind him in the reflection didn't match what he saw over his shoulder. There was a figure there, standing still. Ben spun around. Nothing. But when he turned back to the mirror, the figure remained. It wasn't shadow, and it wasn't flesh. It was something between. A silhouette blurred around the edges, as if the house itself had tried to erase the outline but hadn't quite succeeded. No face, no limbs, just presence. Watching, Ben didn't move. The figure didn't either, but the air grew heavier, like the house was warning him to listen. And then, slowly, the mirror began to fog from the inside. A breath, a slow exhale, and in the mist, a handprint formed, small, childlike. Ben's chest tightened. He knew better than to reach out. He simply stood still, heart pounding, until a word began to form in the condensation. Ramambar. His mouth went dry. What? He whispered aloud, before he could stop himself. The mirror pulsed gently, and the word changed. Ramembr me. A second handprint joined the first. Then a third. He stepped back, heart racing, mind struggling to make sense of it. But in his bones, he already knew. This wasn't someone new. This was someone the house had once failed. Someone whose story had slipped between the floorboards. The hallway dimmed. The mirror went dark, and behind him, a door creaked open slowly. Not a door he used. Not a door he could use. Because there had never been a door there before. He turned. The wall, where the map of the house used to hang, was now split down the middle, revealing a narrow corridor swallowed in black. A draft of air moved past him, sour, old, almost wet, and beneath it, the faintest sound breathing. Ben stepped forward slowly, guided by instinct more than courage. The house didn't stop him. It simply let him pass, as though it, too, needed this to happen. As though this story had waited long enough. The corridor was tight, just wide enough for one person. The walls brushed against his shoulders as he moved, and in the dark he could hear faint whispers, like memories stitched into the plaster. Names, dates, regrets, and then a single voice cut through them all, clear, soft. Ben, he froze. It wasn't a whisper, it wasn't echoed. It was spoken, directly behind him. He turned so quickly he lost his balance, crashing against the wall, breath coming in sharp bursts. No one was there, but the air still moved. The corridor opened into a room, small and low, ceilinged. A single chair sat in the center, and on it, a tape recorder. Old, bulky, covered in dust. He approached slowly, each step slower than the last. The recorder clicked to life on its own. Ben flinched. And then the voice came. It was his own. Younger. Shaken. She said it didn't happen. She said I made it up. But I didn't. I know I didn't. He was there. He said not to say anything. But I did. I told her. And she smiled and told me to go to bed. And I remember thinking, if I go to bed, I'll never wake up the same again. Ben's knees buckled. He dropped to the floor, eyes wide, breath shallow. The tape kept playing. She was supposed to help me. She was supposed to be the one who kept me safe. Click. Silence. The room pulsed once, and then everything went still. Ben didn't move for a long time. Couldn't. His mind reeled backward into places he hadn't dared look in years. He remembered now. Not everything, but enough. The mirror hadn't lied. Someone had been forgotten. Him. That boy. That version of himself who had whispered the truth and been met with silence. That child who had gone to bed hoping not to wake up. The house hadn't failed someone else. It had failed him. And now, all these years later, it had finally brought him back to the place where he could be heard. Ben stood. He didn't take the tape recorder. He didn't destroy it. He simply left it in the chair and whispered, "I hear you now." As he stepped back into the corridor, the door closed behind him. The mirror was clear. The handprints gone. But Ben wasn't the same. He didn't have all the answers. But he had the one thing he'd lost long ago. A voice. His own. And this time, he wouldn't let it be swallowed again. The fire hadn't been lit that night. There was no chill in the air, no storm whispering through the trees, no thunder rolling like a warning across the hills. And yet, Ben smelled smoke. Not the thick, acrid kind that follows destruction, but something softer. Older. The kind that drifts through the air when someone burns paper soaked in memory. The scent led him to the study, where the fireplace sat dark and unused. At first glance, everything appeared untouched. Books still resting where he left them. Curtains still swaying gently in the stillness. But the smell persisted. Then he saw it. A single curl of smoke drifting lazily from the mouth of the fireplace. No flame. No heat. Just smoke. Like a ghost exhaling. Ben crouched and peered inside, expecting to find a smoldering log, maybe a stray ember left behind. But instead, what he saw made him freeze. A piece of paper. Unburnt. Sitting upright against the back brick wall, as if someone had carefully placed it there for him to find. Ben reached in and pulled it free. The paper was warm, but not scorched. Its edges were faintly singed, as if it had been plucked from a fire just moments before it surrendered to ash. He held it up, hands trembling slightly. It was a letter, written in a woman's hand. A hand he hadn't seen in years. To the boy I never listened to, Ben's breath caught in his throat. His knees weakened. He sat down hard on the rug, unable to look away from the curling script that followed. I didn't believe you. That truth alone has been a blade I've swallowed every night since. You told me, in your trembling way, that something was wrong. And God, I smiled. I smiled like I was trying to calm you. But really, I smiled because I was scared. Scared that if you were telling the truth, then I had already failed you. So I made you doubt yourself instead. Ben felt his vision blur. The handwriting was unmistakable. It was hers. His mother's. I don't know how this letter found you. Maybe it never did. Maybe the house is playing tricks. Or maybe it remembers better than I ever could. But if you're reading this, then somehow, somewhere, a part of me kept trying. Kept writing. Even after you stopped speaking. The paper shook in his hands. I wish I could take back the silence. I wish I had pulled you into my arms that night and said, I believe you. I wish I had told him to leave. I wish I had screamed. I wish I had fought. But most of all, I wish I had been a mother when you needed one. Ben could hear her voice now. Not the sharp one. Not the tired one, but the softer one. The voice she used when reading bedtime stories, back when things still felt whole. He'd buried that sound. Or thought he had. The world made me afraid, and I passed that fear onto you like a curse. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But if this letter has reached you, then I beg one thing: don't bury your voice like I buried mine. Don't let silence win. Speak. Scream. Write. Be louder than I was brave. There was no signature. Just a smudge at the bottom of the page, as if a tear had fallen before the ink could dry. Ben stared at the words for what felt like hours. They were too specific to be imagined. Too raw. Too honest. And yet his mother had died years ago. There had been no note. No final conversation. Just a slow fade into memory, and a lifetime of questions he'd forced into quiet. But now, here, her voice had found him. Whether it was magic, madness, or something else entirely, he didn't care. The house had done what it always did. It had remembered what others forgot. He stood and walked to the mantel, placing the letter beside the box he'd opened nights ago. They looked right together. like two pieces of a puzzle long separated by shame and years. And as he stood there, the fire sparked. By itself. No wood, no match's flame. Soft, gentle, warm. Ben didn't flinch. He sat by the hearth and let the heat touch his skin. Let the light brush across his face. Let the smoke rise once more. Not in warning, but in ceremony. The house had kept the letter safe. It had waited. And now, finally, it had delivered her last words. They weren't enough to fix everything, but they were more than he thought he'd ever receive. And in that quiet, sacred space between grief and forgiveness, Ben did something he hadn't done in years. He wept. Not in despair, but in release, because someone, somewhere had heard him. And this time they wrote back. The grandfather clock in the foyer had never worked. Not once. Not since the day Ben arrived. It stood like a silent sentinel near the entrance, its hands perpetually frozen at 3:17. No ticking, no chime, no presence. Just a looming reminder that some things, once broken, never start again. He had stopped noticing it after the first week. It was just another forgotten artifact in a house filled with ghosts and echoes. But on the morning after the letter appeared, Ben heard it. A single, hollow chime, low, drawn out, and deeply out of place. He froze mid-step in the kitchen, nearly dropping his mug. The sound hadn't been a dream. He felt it in his spine, like a wire pulled taut behind his ribs. He crossed the room and walked toward the clock slowly, unsure whether he wanted it to happen again. The foyer was quiet, draped in morning light that filtered in through the tall windows, soft and gold, and too peaceful for anything unnatural. But there it stood, the clock, no longer asleep. Its hands had moved. 3:14. Ben blinked. He hadn't seen them shift, but they had. And 3 minutes had reversed. He moved closer, examining the face, the faded numerals, the ornate hands. Everything looked the same. Nothing had changed except the direction. The longer hand crept backward, smooth, deliberate, a minute hand chasing the past. Ben reached out, cautiously placing his fingers on the glass. Cold. Too cold for the warm sunlight surrounding it. He knelt, opened the lower panel, and peered inside. The pendulum swayed, but in reverse. Back and back, smooth as water flowing uphill. A strange rhythm hummed from within. Not mechanical, not natural. Like breathing, but with the cadence of time unmaking itself. He wanted to close the panel and walk away, but he didn't. Instead, he reached in. His fingers brushed something strange, not part of the mechanism. Soft, thin, paper. Ben withdrew it slowly, a folded page, yellowed and brittle. It looked older than the house itself, the edges cracked, the ink nearly faded to nothing. There was a name written at the top. Harold Finch. He didn't know the name, but the moment he whispered it, the clock chimed again. Another hollow note, and this time the hands jumped. 3:08. Ben stared in disbelief. 5 minutes had vanished in the span of a breath. He unfolded the paper carefully. It was a journal entry. March 19th, 1912. I built the damn thing to hold a moment still, not rewind it. I should have burned the design the second I saw what it could do. But then, she died. And the silence in the house got so loud. So I turned it on, just for a moment, just to go back and say goodbye. But she wasn't waiting. Not the way I remembered, not the way I wanted. And now every time I use it, she changes. Less her, more shadow. And the clock keeps pulling time backward, like it's trying to bring her here, from someplace she doesn't belong. Ben's skin prickled. The man, Harold, had built the clock. And whatever he'd done, it hadn't been about telling time. It had been about bending it. And somewhere in that desperate pull toward grief, he'd broken something fundamental. Ben looked up at the hands again. 3:06. They were speeding up. And suddenly, the air shifted. The foyer dimmed. A shadow passed across the far window. No form, no shape. Just an impression of movement that didn't belong. The wood of the floor beneath him groaned, but not from weight. From age. The walls flickered. Not the lights, the walls. For a second, less than a second, they looked different. Wallpaper faded to newness. The old oil painting above the mirror restored, a faint scent of perfume in the air. Then it was gone. Ben stepped back, heart racing. The clock's pendulum swung faster, time unraveling, not metaphorically, literally. Whatever Harold had done, it was happening again. And the house, this place that remembered everyone so carefully, was being dragged into a version of itself that no longer existed. Ben acted on instinct. He pulled the journal page from his pocket and slid it back into the clock. He slammed the panel shut. The pendulum shuddered, then stilled. The ticking stopped, and the hands froze. 3:03. The air steadied. The foyer settled, but the shadow, it didn't leave. It lingered near the window, just beyond the edge of the glass, watching, as if deciding whether the invitation to return had been sincere or a mistake. Ben didn't look away. "Not this time," he said softly. He reached for the old velvet curtain and pulled it across the window. The shadow faded. The house was still again, but not peaceful. Beneath the floor, beneath the walls, beneath the layers of stories and whispered names, something had stirred. The clock had been built to grieve backward, to reclaim what had already gone. But the house had never been about going back. It had always been about carrying forward. Ben took one last look at the frozen timepiece. He wasn't sure what Harold had truly lost, but he knew what it had cost, and he wasn't willing to pay the same price. The room at the end of the east wing had always been locked. Not bolted, not nailed shut, just locked, with a keyhole no one could match and a doorknob that never turned. It was the only room Ben had never entered, never cleaned, never spoken about to the guests who came and went like waves. Most of them never even noticed it. The house had a way of hiding things it didn't want to talk about. But tonight, it wanted to talk. It started with scratching. Not loud, not wild. Just faint, soft, deliberate strokes from the other side of the door. Ben heard it while reading near the fireplace, the sound threading its way through the hush of the evening. At first, he thought it was the branches outside, scraping against the house in rhythm with the wind. But the sound came again, sharper, closer, insistent. The scratching was inside. He stood slowly, placing the book face down on the armrest. The air in the house hadn't shifted. There was no chill, no flicker of lights. But still, something tightened. The way the walls seemed to lean ever so slightly inward, as if the house was holding its breath again. Ben walked toward the east wing, each step muffled by the runner that lined the hardwood floor. The corridor felt longer than usual. The walls a little taller. The light bulbs along the sconces flickered, not with electricity, but with hesitation. And there it was. The door, same as always. Weathered white paint, iron keyhole, stubborn brass knob. But tonight, there were 3 small scratches carved into the wood just above the handle. Fresh. He reached out and touched them with his fingertips. The grooves were shallow but recent, still rough with splinters, and then he saw the note. Folded, pressed gently beneath the doorframe, just enough of it sticking out for him to notice. He crouched, pulled it free, and opened it. One word, please. Ben's chest tightened. He stood there for a moment, staring at the note, before pressing his ear against the door. No sound. No whisper. Just the pressure of something waiting. The knob turned in his hand. He hadn't expected that. No key. No struggle. Just a slow, easy turn, as if the door had finally decided to open itself. And it did, inch by inch, the hinges groaning not with resistance, but wariness. A sigh, more than a creak. The room beyond was dim. Dust hovered in the air like fog in a church. A single window, long boarded over, let no light in. Only the soft glow from the hallway spilled across the threshold, revealing furniture covered in white sheets and a thick carpet layered in footprints, one set. Barefoot. Small, Ben stepped inside. The door closed behind him without a sound. The room was colder, not by temperature, but memory. The kind of cold that sits behind your eyes and makes you remember things you didn't want to remember. He pulled the sheet from the first chair, revealing a child's rocker, old wood, cracked along the base, the seat worn smooth by years of use. A whisper brushed against his ear. Not spoken aloud, just a thought too strong to keep out. She never left. Ben turned. In the far corner of the room, the sheet over the bed moved slightly, not blown by air. Shifted, he approached slowly, each step heavy. When he pulled the sheet back, he expected bones, dust, nothing. Instead, he found her, not sleeping, not whole. A girl, maybe 9 or 10, curled under thin blankets. Her eyes open and glassy. Her skin wasn't rotting. It wasn't even cold. It looked as though she'd fallen asleep only moments ago. But Ben knew that wasn't true. Knew it in the way the room pressed inward. Knew it in the way her lips parted, whispering something soundless. He knelt beside her. She looked at him. Really looked at him. And for the first time in a long time, he didn't ask a question. He simply listened. Because the story was already here. Written in the lines of the floor, in the dust around her body, in the way the room refused to move on. She had stayed too long, long after the others had gone, long after the house had tried to forget. She had whispered her pain into the corners and folds of the house until the house became her. And when no one came for her, she stayed behind, not as a ghost, but as a child who refused to stop waiting. Ben reached out and touched her hand. Warm, alive, but her eyes never blinked. She wasn't dead. She wasn't living. She was held, frozen between moments, locked in the room the house had hidden even from itself. "I'm sorry," he whispered. The house groaned softly above him, and then her fingers twitched. Barely, but enough. The whisper came again, not from her mouth, but from the space between them. "Don't let him shut me in again." Ben didn't know who he was. Not yet. But he nodded. He stood, moved to the boarded-up window, and pulled at the nails with his bare hands. The wood groaned. Splinters bit into his palms. But he kept going, nail by nail, until the last board fell away. Sunlight flooded the room. It struck her face. And for the first time she closed her eyes. Not from pain, not from fear, from peace. Ben turned. The room breathed, and the dust began to settle. He didn't close the door when he left. He left it open. Because she didn't need to be shut away anymore. She had waited long enough. For days after the room at the end of the east wing opened, the house grew still in a way that felt neither safe nor soothing. It wasn't the quiet of rest. It was the quiet of anticipation, like the house was watching itself, waiting for something to come home. The girl never reappeared, not in footsteps, not in flickers, not even in the mirrors that usually caught fragments of what the house held close. She was gone, or maybe released, but the absence she left behind rang louder than any presence ever had. Ben felt it every time he passed her room. The way the light hung in the doorway like breath held too long. But the real shift came from upstairs. It started with the dust. It stopped collecting. The third floor had always been dormant. Closed off, not forbidden, just forgotten. There had never been any rule against going up there. Most guests never noticed the staircase tucked behind the archway near the library. It didn't draw attention to itself. Ben had only been up there once when he first arrived, just to check the rooms. They'd all been empty, undisturbed for decades, the air thick and still, so he left them that way, until now. The dust was gone, not cleaned, gone. Even the thickest corners, the windowsills, the untouched banisters, all bare, not even a footprint, as if someone had erased the layer of time itself. Ben stood at the bottom of the staircase and stared upward, heart ticking faster. The steps looked the same, but they felt different now, like walking them would be a kind of trespassing. Still, he climbed. The steps didn't groan, they breathed. Each one exhaled softly beneath his weight, as though remembering how to be walked on. The air grew warmer the higher he went, the kind of warmth that doesn't come from heat, but from memory, the soft residue of laughter, candlelight, and old perfume. When he reached the top landing, the hallway unfolded like a quiet prayer. There were 5 doors. Only one was open. Ben moved toward it, slow, cautious, and as he passed the other rooms, he noticed something strange. There were no doorknobs, just keyholes. Smooth, round, and faintly polished, as though many hands had turned keys there once. But those doors remained shut. The open door led to a sitting room. And inside, a woman stood by the window. She wasn't a ghost. She wasn't a trick of the house. She was real. She turned as he stepped in, her expression unreadable, as though she'd been interrupted mid-thought. Her hair was tied loosely at the neck, gray but not old, and her eyes, those were the kind of eyes that had seen everything and still held some softness for the world. She didn't speak. Neither did Ben, because he knew her, not her name, not her story, but the ache behind her eyes. It was the same one he'd carried all these years. She gestured to the chair across from her and sat without a word. Ben followed, lowering himself into the seat like someone obeying something deeper than conversation. Then she spoke. Only 3 words. "He's almost here." Ben's mouth went dry. "Who?" Her gaze drifted to the window again. The one the house can't forget. He didn't understand, but the way she said it made his chest tighten. "You mean someone who died here?" "No," she said softly. "Someone who should have." The silence after that filled the entire room. Ben tried to gather himself. "Who are you?" "I'm the last one who stayed," she answered. "Before you." She smiled faintly. "The house needed someone new. And it always finds someone. It found you." Ben stared, unsure how to process what she was saying. "So what happens now?" She stood and walked to the doorway, fingers brushing the edge of the old frame. "Now you understand what's coming." Ben rose. "Coming from where?" She turned to face him fully. From below. There was no fear in her voice, no panic. Just certainty. "You've opened too many doors, Ben. Set too many memories free. And now the ones that were buried deepest are starting to rise." She reached into her coat and handed him a small brass key. It was warm, heavy, and shaped like the keyholes on the doors outside. "You'll need to open the others before he does." Ben looked down at it, then back up, but she was gone. No sound, no trace, just the scent of something long forgotten. Lavender and wood smoke. He stepped out of the room, heart pounding, and looked at the 4 doors in the hallway. 4 secrets. 4 rooms the house had kept locked for a reason, and now they were his to open, because someone was coming. Not a visitor. Not a ghost. Something worse. The one the house couldn't forget, and when he arrived, he would not. Ben stood in front of the first door for a long time, the brass key hot in his palm, like it had been waiting years to be used. The hallway behind him remained still, but not quiet. Quiet was something peaceful, something earned. This was silence forced into every crack, like the house itself was listening to the moment. The Dorknobless wood in front of him was a darker shade than the others, as if stained by something time had tried to clean but failed. There was no plaque, no markings, no hint of what waited behind it. Just a keyhole, shaped perfectly for what he held. He slid the key in. It resisted, not mechanically, but spiritually, like the door knew it should stay shut. But Ben pressed forward, and the lock gave with a reluctant click. The door didn't swing open. It inhaled. He felt it, like breath being drawn in before something terrible is spoken aloud. Inside, there was no light, not dimness, not shadow. Absence. The moment the door cracked open, every flicker of candlelight in the hallway behind him died. Even the faint daylight from the far windows recoiled, curling back down the stairs as if fleeing something it had seen before. Ben's hand hovered near the threshold, but instinct screamed not to step inside. And then the whisper came, "You left me here." A voice, not unfamiliar, not monstrous, but intimate, his own. Ben's breath hitched. He turned slowly, but the hallway remained empty. The voice had come from inside the room, from the darkness, from a part of himself long buried under years of forgetting. He stepped in, and the door closed behind him. Instantly, the sound was ripped from the air. His breathing vanished. His heartbeat silenced. Even the whisper of fabric against skin as he moved was gone. This was not silence, it was deletion. Sound had no permission here. Ben reached forward blindly. The air was thick, like pushing through velvet soaked in ash. His fingers brushed against a wall, cool and smooth like glass, though he couldn't see it. And then, a flash, a scene. A room flooded with pale blue light. A boy, him, standing in the center, barefoot, with his hands clenched into fists. A man stood in front of him, shadowed, towering, smiling in a way that didn't reach his eyes. The boy spoke, but no words came. Just movement, pleading. And the man knelt, whispered something too low to hear, and then everything snapped away. Ben stumbled back, gasping, the vision gone. But the feeling it left behind pulsed through him like poison. This wasn't a memory. It was a prison. Built by him. For the piece of himself that saw too much, too young, and was too afraid to carry it forward. He had locked that boy in this room. Not just emotionally, not metaphorically, but truly. In the house's language, which honored wounds by giving them rooms of their own. Another flash. The boy again, older now, staring into a mirror. Blood on his chin. A cracked toothbrush in his hand. No sign of injury, just the blood. And that same silence, suffocating and immense, as he tried to scream but couldn't even hear his own voice. Ben fell to his knees. Tears poured from his eyes, not from sorrow, but recognition. He had left pieces of himself behind to survive, and now, in the house that remembered everything, those pieces had become rooms. Walls, locks, and each one needed to be faced before he arrived. The one who fed on fragments. The one who gained strength from silence. The one the house could never forget. Ben stood, shaking, but stronger than before. He turned toward where he thought the door might be. "No more hiding," he said. "No more rooms." And just like that, the door opened. The sound rushed back in, a flood of breath and heartbeat and creaking wood. Light spilled in from the hallway. He stepped out and shut the door behind him. But this time, it didn't lock. It stayed open. Not to haunt, but to heal. One down. 3 to go. He looked at the next door. A pale yellow frame, a faint smell of smoke, and the undeniable sound of humming coming from the other side. A lullaby, one he hadn't heard since he was 5. Ben tightened his grip on the key. The house wasn't just remembering him, it was rebuilding him. And he was running out of time. The final door waited for him like it always knew he'd come. No color, no sound. It was just there, gray and still. Like the idea of a door more than the real thing. The others had tried to resist. They had fought to stay closed, not from malice, but out of mercy. But this one stood calm and confident. It didn't care whether he opened it. It didn't need to beg or hide. Because what was behind this door wasn't something remembered. It was something that had never left. Ben approached slowly. The key clenched so tightly in his hand he felt the grooves digging into his palm. This door had no keyhole, no handle, just a small mark, pressed faintly in the center, like a thumbprint burned into the wood. He didn't need to guess what to do. His hand rose without permission, his fingers pressing to the mark. The door vanished. No creak, no slam, no shifting into shadow. It simply ceased to be, and beyond it stood the man. Tall, impossibly tall. He wore a coat that didn't move, no matter how the house around him breathed. His hands were bare, long, fingered and too still. And his face, God, his face, wasn't missing, it was wrong. Like someone had almost drawn a face, but stopped halfway through. A nose without curve, a mouth without lines, eyes that were just too far apart, like the spacing was off by inches. And yet your brain tried to force it into something familiar. Ben didn't speak. The man didn't blink. Behind him stretched a hallway that shouldn't exist. Long, narrow, lined with pictures turned backward on the walls. Dozens of them. Frames of forgotten moments. Every now and then, one twitched, like something inside was trying to turn and look. The man took a step forward, and the house groaned. Not like wood, but like an organ that had been pierced. Ben felt it in his chest. A deep pull downward. Gravity bending. The man opened his mouth. No voice came. But Ben heard it anyway, inside his head. Like the echo of a scream that had already ended. You let them out. Ben's knees trembled, but he didn't fall. The man took another step. They were mine. Ben found his voice barely. They were never yours. The man tilted his head. Something cracked in the distance. You locked them away, he said, quieter now, but heavier. That's all I needed. The house flickered, walls turning translucent, floors vibrating, mirrors shaking with reflectionless fury. Ben gritted his teeth. Not anymore, he said. The man stepped forward again, and the hallway behind him snapped into color. Flames burst into one of the backward portraits. Another frame fell from the wall and shattered. Each step he took made the house forget. Forget what it had healed. Forget what it had forgiven. I don't want to kill you, Ben whispered. But I won't let you stay. The man smiled. Finally, a terrible, jagged expression that didn't fit his face. That peeled back too far, as if the skin had forgotten how to hold the shape. I'm not here to stay, he said. I'm here to finish. Ben remembered the letter. The child in the room who never blinked. The voice in the mirror. The reversed clock. It all pointed here. All roads led to the door that didn't want to be found. Because what was inside wasn't just trauma. It wasn't just memory. It was the thing that grew when you buried memory. The rot that fed on silence. The shape that emerged when a soul was broken enough to splinter. Ben took a step back. The man didn't chase him. He just moved with him, like gravity again. Slow. Inevitable. Ben turned and ran. Back down the hall. Past the doors. Past the memories. Toward the stairs. And the man followed. Not quickly. Not loudly. But the house trembled. Paint peeled from the walls in ribbons. Rooms blinked in and out of themselves. First whole, then ruined, then newborn. The library turned inside out. Books pouring like water from ceiling cracks. Ben reached the foyer, panting, the front door wide open. Not opened by him. Open for him. Sunlight spilled in, blinding and clean. But when he looked behind him, the man hadn't come down the stairs. He stood at the top, watching. And for the first time, he seemed unsure. Ben stepped backward into the light. The moment his foot touched the threshold, the house shouted, not with a voice, with everything. Walls cracked from floor to ceiling. Mirrors exploded outward. And the man at the top of the stairs howled, not in pain, but rage. A silent scream that tore at the edges of reality itself. The house had chosen. It wanted Ben to leave, and it wanted him to stay, forever. Ben stumbled outside, the air suddenly too fresh, too loud, too bright. Behind him, the door slammed, not shut. Gone, where the house had been, there was nothing. Not rubble, not ashes, just grass, and wind, and birdsong. Ben collapsed to his knees. He didn't cry, didn't scream. He just sat there, skin shaking with everything he couldn't say. The house had remembered him. Every part. It gave him back the truth, the voice, the pain. And then it took the one who wanted to erase it all. The man with no name. The one who thrived in forgetting he was gone. And Ben. Ben finally remembered everything. And still he remained. Alive. Whole. Free.